Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to Normal America Show. Host robnoerr. Got a good one tonight. I'll be talking to my friend Fabian Liberty about COVID and other things. I hope everyone is having a fantastic evening. I am. We have Buzzy Bob quoting the Venga Boys, of all people. Haven't heard that song in a hot minute, so good on that. But I hope everyone's doing well. I will try to be done by 11 this evening as I have some family over. Hopefully they'll still be awake when I'm done streaming. So, I don't think I'm Robert Noor Jr., not that I'm aware of. My dad was Terry Noor. When I was growing up, there was a boxer named Terry Norris, which mean my dad always liked because of the similar name. But yeah, so it should be a good talk. I'll join Fabian here in a moment. Got to make sure my audio is working and all of that good stuff. But it should be good. And I'm sure we'll talk about more than just COVID. But yeah, it's been a crazy day. News-wise and all that good stuff. So this will be the last stream I do before next week, so before the new year. So happy new year to everyone, because I won't be seeing you. New Year's Eve also happens to be my wife's birthday, and it's Christmas at her dad's house. I have like 50 Christmases. It's like every day there's another Christmas. Oh, Christmas at your aunt's tonight. Okay. And then tomorrow will be like, Christmas. You remember that? You remember that guy we used to know like 17 years ago? Well, his son's having a Christmas party. We're going. I'm just kidding. It's not that bad, but it's nice to actually have people that care. But, sometimes it's nice just to have an evening with your family by yourselves. And it seems around this time of the year that's difficult to come by, at least for me. So a good problem to have. A lot of loved ones that invite you over and that really enjoy your company. So I'm not going to complain too much about it, but I do have some family over here tonight, like I said, so we'll try to keep the stream to 11 p.m., maybe a little after 11 p.m. I always run late, but we'll try tonight. Like I said, we'll be talking to Fabian. He did message me. He sent me an article that he wanted to talk about sort of files that have been released regarding COVID, about how they wanted to distribute medications and things based on equity, which I know what that means is code for racism, to denigrate white people, straight people, males, Christians, etc. That's what equity means. It's not equality. It is racism by another name. That's what it is. But unfortunately, it was behind a paywall, so I was unable to read it. So I'm sure we'll go through it, though. And I'm aware of at least some of the work that they did. I talked heavily when they first released the vaccine, the sort of CDC slideshow that they had presented that talked about giving the vaccine based on racial equity, which is just racism. So, yeah, maybe we'll talk some about the Andrew Tate stuff. I don't really have anything to say about it. I don't know exactly what's going on. I would be skeptical. It does seem like this is someone that they'd want to take down. I'm not a big Andrew Tate fan, I'll be honest. I do think that there is a role for people like that are talking about, in a very, gruff way, to improve yourself and to not pity yourself. I don't have a problem with that. I think that some people could be sort of a-holes that go too far with that. It's the same mantra that the Groypers try to use. Oh, you're fat. Oh, you're this. Oh, you're that. You need to get better. And it's like, okay, maybe that's true, but you need to not be an a-hole, I guess. So I don't know. Buzzy, do you have to type in all caps all the time? Just a question. But I don't know. Maybe he did what he's accused of. Maybe, Buzzy's saying he wasn't even arrested. He was just taken for questioning. Maybe that's true. Maybe he didn't, and they're just harassing him. Maybe they'll set him up. I don't know. I don't know anything about it. I don't really have much to add. But, I will say in general, if you are effective at sort of countering the establishment narrative, they will investigate you and try to find a way to bring you down. That doesn't mean that he's not guilty of what he's accused of. I don't even know what he's accused of. I have no clue. Human trafficking in what way? I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, oftentimes when things like this happen, more facts come out. So I don't know. I'm not too worried about it. Not losing sleep over it. Which one is Fabian? There we go. All right. You're going to lose me visually here for a second. We'll try to get started. Again, I'm going to be streaming with Fabian Liberty. So you should still be able to hear me, but I want to make sure all my stuff's good to go. Yeah, looks good, looks good. All right. Once they drag me into live room, yeah. But yeah, it's one of those things, it's like Elon Musk. Here's the unfortunate truth. I think
I'm just saying, bring him in.
What's up?
Hard dicks and helicopters, my guy.
How's it going?
Oh man. Well, Mark and I both have COVID right now. So Mark got hit a lot harder than I did. So Mark's gonna dip out while we talk. So get some rest. See if we're gonna do a reaction after this.
Yeah, that works fine. I do home health care, and actually one of the people I work with got COVID, so I had to do the whole quarantine and test every day. I didn't have it though. I tested negative, but.
Well, I mean, there's so many I don't know how those PCR like at home tests are so fucking inaccurate. They have false positives and false negatives out the wazoo, and then of course it's like this virus is constantly fucking changing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you had what? You had Alpha variant, you had Delta variant, you had you had Omicron. Right, but then there was like 17 variants before Omicron actually came forward, and now then we had Omicron B4, which is what Trump got, I think. Then we had Omicron B5, which is what Biden got, and now there's Omicron BQ 1.1, which is probably what we have. I don't fucking know.
Even if you look at so I was debating someone the other day, and we were looking at a CDC paper, or no, it was a New England Journal of Medicine paper, and it was breaking down. Comparing protection from Pfizer vaccine to Moderna vaccine to natural immunity to a combination of them. And when you looked, it was only focusing on Omicron, and then it gave the designation for Omicron that was BAFG 7.1, BAFG 7.2. And it's holy shit, as a layman, it's hard enough to look at this stuff. But once you start breaking it down like that, suffice it to say natural immunity was superior in all metrics, as we've known for quite some time. But it's interesting.
We knew that from the very beginning.
Right.
One of the things that I've taken issue with is some of the people talking about this, natural immunity being better than vaccinated, right? Which is true. We've always known that. We knew at the very beginning of the pandemic that there was some level of conferred immunity for people with MERS. Mm-hmm. We knew people that had Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome had some level of immunity. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to talk with you about this because there's a couple of things that it's kind of been brought back up because of this, people's CDC, which we were just talking about, right? And how we all need to be panicking. We need to mask forever. And, some of the people are finally kind of recanting some of the bullshit that they had and the COVID amnesty and things. I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a recap and talk with you about it because it's this is the gift that keeps on giving for content that isn't, doing a panel with minor attracted persons.
You avoided that. You avoided that evil scumbag shit. Good for you. Right? Like any normal human being, it's unreal. BPF from the Crucible, one of the things I've talked to him a lot about is I understand people selling out, but what constantly shocks me is how little people are willing to sell out for. Oh boy, 5 more viewers. I'll stream with a bunch of pedos talking about, well, maybe we do need to listen. Like, no. If I was on that panel, it would have lasted 3 minutes for me. I would have been like, I hope I never see you in real life, and you all should be in prison for the rest of your lives. End of panel. I'm out. Good luck, but neither here nor there.
Yeah, I had to throw a little dig out because I was like, Jesus fuck.
I know.
I was just like, Jesus Christ. Are you streaming?
Yeah. The cutthroat world of, the big numbers on Twitch streaming, got to get those 3-4 more viewers and sell out a little more. It's ridiculous.
It's like, what's funny to me is like, why talk to maps when you can just buy views? I know half of these fuckers do anyways.
Yep. Yeah,
I mean, like, why? Like, the 5 more viewers to do that crazy drama shit. Like, just talk about some real shit. And you know why they don't? Because they don't have anything to say about real shit.
They can't.
They don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Like, this is getting a little meta, but that's why so many people are attracted to the panels, because you can hide, right? Like, you get a bigger audience. Because let's say I do a panel with a bigger left-wing streamer. Let's say Vosh is doing a panel and me and you are on it, which he won't, because Vosh will run from people like me and you.
Yeah,
but
Vosh is a pussy.
The only way he would ever debate us is on a panel or something, because he could hide. You could just meme your way through it. But what you do then, if you're everyone else, you're like, oh, all of his viewers are watching me. And then you just have a couple of talking points that you had going in, and you don't interact with what the other people were saying, and you just be basically irrelevant.
Yeah,
and that's how you
it is one
pad
thing
your
I've
viewers.
noticed. I remember one thing I noticed, and the first time I noticed it was when, I want to say it was a hippy dippy, right? And I did a panel, and we were talking about like the Voting Rights Act. Right. And I was clearly the only one that actually did any reading of the bill. Mm-hmm. And then so what I brought up was like, hey, you talking about voting rights, why is it that in this bill it moves all court cases based off of voting rights to the DC appellate court and circumnavigates the entire Constitution and judicial review that is supposed to occur where appellate courts happen in your district, where you're in a district, right? And then where certain Supreme Court judges have districts selected to them to determine whether or not they want to bring it forward, and then they discuss amongst themselves. Why are we circumnavigating the entire Constitution and judicial review? This is clearly a sham to have gerrymandering specifically be utilized by like a very left-wing thing. And I brought that point up, and I brought it up like 4 times on the panel. And every single person on Hippy Dippy completely acted like I never said that. And it was I was like, oh, you can just attack somebody else and just ignore any strong point on a panel that makes you look like an idiot.
That's exactly right. And if you see, like, I'm a right winger, I guess, like, so you try, I don't blame Dylan or the people setting up the panels. What you're trying to do is set up 4 righties, 4 lefties, have some sort of mix, some sort of disagreement on issues. I get that. But what ends up happening is this. It'll be 2 righties that are basically lefties by another name, and then me, and then someone who's like ridiculously a caricature of right wingers. So like, I remember, and the person's probably watching right now. I like this person, but it was a bad take from them. We were talking about immigration, illegal immigration. And so I had this take that was like, look, before we talk about what to do with Dreamers, we need border security, but it is unfeasible to kick 30 million people out. But the first things, so I have more of a nuanced take, not that nuanced, but more of one. And this dude's like, we just need to set up turrets at the border and shoot every motherfucker that comes within, and then do you think anyone's responding to me? They're just like, here we go, crazy bloodthirsty right winger. And that's the way these panels work. If you are on there and you have something to say that sort of actually pertains to the topic, that in a way that's interesting to talk about, they're not interested. They attack the weak point, and you can't even blame people. That's the nature of the panel. I myself I've been people that have made good points on an issue, but I don't have time to respond to it because I'm responding to some insane shit that someone said, and they're like, you're a racist, and then you're like, no, here's 10 reasons you're wrong. So I get it. The whole panel system sucks, but the reason people do it, so many people, I'm not going to say names or anything here, but there are so many people that can't make it on their own. They can't do content by themselves, and they can't carry a one-on-one debate, right? So what you do is you enter the panel circuit, and I will always think it's funny, regardless of what you think of Destiny. It is so funny to watch the left cut off their nose to spite their face. By kicking Destiny off, all the numbers on those panel shows dropped because he was the one person that was willing to go on those panels and bring big numbers of viewers. So, okay, congratulations, Keffels and the trans mafia on Twitch.
Yeah,
you got him kicked off. Now enjoy your no viewers, you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is that, like, Twitch politics is... It's an interesting thing. I was talking about this earlier, but I really do want to talk about COVID, so I'm going to swing back to that after this. But you know, Twitch politics in general is, like, there's a community, and the community is leftist, right? And you know this because, like, I was on Twitter the other day, and I was like, oh wow, Wick's doing really well. And then, like, I see him on Twitter, and it's like, thank you so much, Chud Logic. Thank you so much, Not So Erudite. Thank you so much, this person. Thank you so much, this person. Thank you so much, this person, for all the raids, right? And I was just like, and the thing is that they all share the same audience, and so, like, and they cannibalize each other's audiences by, like, engaging in whatever drama or whatever thing they can do to get that audience over to them for that day. Whereas, like, people like you and me, Twitch politics isn't our audience. Like, we primarily pull from offsite, or pull people from YouTube, from Twitter, people that have, like, found me that were, like, homeless here, right? And so it's like, you know, everything that I have in our community is mostly just our community, right? Like, there's some sharing. Like, I have people that watch you, and you know, and vice versa, I'm sure. But, like, for the most part, it's like probably 70% of my audience are people that just watch me. Whereas it's probably like 20% for a lot of these other people. Yeah. And so it's like when you got rid of Destiny, you fucked yourselves like really bad. Like, you and I were probably mostly isolated because most of our viewers were not Destiny viewers.
Right. Yeah, there might have been like 2 or 3 people that watch me regularly that regularly watch Destiny, so it's not going to affect me numbers-wise. Look, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? So I'm not saying this about everyone, but you know, I genuinely want people to grow that have ideas similar to me, or that have ideas that even if I disagree with, I think are interesting. I genuinely feel that way. I don't feel it's a zero-sum game. I would not give a shit if 6 months from now, you're pulling in 10,000 viewers. I'm not going to be embittered on my show like, oh, those could have been... it would be good for me. But even if it wasn't, I wouldn't give a shit. I wouldn't give a shit. And what you see is so many of these people, and it happens... I'm not saying there aren't people on the right like this.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick. If in 6 months you were getting 10K viewers and I was getting the same viewers, I would legitimately be mad. I can act like I'm not going to be mad, and I can be like, no, it's great for Robnoerr. But if I was sitting chilling in like the 30s and 40s, and you were in 10K, I'd be like, what the fuck do these people see in him that they do not see in me? What the fuck am I doing? Like, this is some bullshit. Like, don't even lie. You know, you'd be a little bit like, this motherfucker.
No, I wouldn't. I honestly wouldn't. With this one caveat, if you didn't ghost
a little bit, you'd be like, this is some bullshit, man. Like, when am I getting some of this love?
But listen, like, if you didn't ghost me, I would be okay with it, right? Like, there are people that are bigger right wingers, right? I don't know. Like, I'll give you an example. Like Lauren Southern. Like, asked me to do these Odyssey game things. I agreed and then forgot it was a day that I was supposed to be at a party, so I was blackout drunk doing these stupid games, eating bugs and shit like that. And then part of it was like, oh yeah, and then Lauren's gonna, like, we're gonna do a show together, just like, you know, a conversation or whatever. And that was like over a year ago, and I've reached out to her producer, which I know several times. It's like, by the way, it's still interested in doing a show with Lauren. Oh, well, she's really busy, she doesn't have time, which is true 90% of the time, but it's like, really, you couldn't find one day in a year? Couldn't find one day? You know, and it's like,
no, not Lauren. Lauren has abandoned you. Oh,
yeah, man, which I don't give a shit about, but it's just that there's a, you know, there's some sort of etiquette. I
think she still thinks I'm a commie.
That's funny. I don't mind her. Yeah. I'm not like embittered or anything. I'm just saying that there is part of that that's like, you know, I am actively trying to think, and you know this, we've had conversations off the air. I'm actively trying to be like, I would like a community to grow. I think Twitch is a space that we could start to make inroads culturally against these insane lefties. So I'd like to see people grow that aren't in that group. Even if you're like a moderate lefty, I would like to see that grow. And I think that what you see is a lot of this cannibalization, particularly on the left, because think about it, there's so much competition if you're streaming politics on the left on a space like Twitch, that the average person just isn't getting shit for viewers. So you're like a vampire. As soon as you see someone like have some drama, you latch onto it because you're like, now's my chance. And like, there were people, I remember watching left-wing streamers I know tweeting out like, oh boy, if you're in Destiny's audience, now that he's gone, come watch me. And it's like, damn, you guys are bloodthirsty. Like, if you got kicked off, I can't imagine being like, oh well, hey, Fabian's audience, why don't you come to me? I'd be like, this fucking sucks. What are we doing kicking this guy off? This is ridiculous. But not them. With friends like that, right? Like, so I hope that I never become that. Yeah.
So,
but
circling back to COVID, right?
Yeah.
Because both of us are prone to tangents. One of the things that like never gets talked about enough is, and one of the things I kind of wanted to talk with you about is this data has been available from the very beginning. And all it is, right? If you just type in CDC COVID deaths by age in Google, right? Mm-hmm. You bring up the provisional deaths by COVID-19 death, sex, and age, right? Nope, that's not the one I'm looking for. Where it is, weekly updates. Here we go. Right, and so I'm gonna stream it to you because I just want to.
Good. I
want to look at comorbidities and conditions, right? And so let me stream this real quick. To you. Give me just a second. All right, you got that?
Yep.
Let me fix my camera so it's not all wild.
Oh, there's our DMs. Oh shit.
So,
no, just
this is something that I talk about often, and I don't see enough people talking about. And it infuriates me that I don't see enough people talking about it. Because it's probably the most important thing to talk about. And it's always been the biggest like red flag to me. So we keep getting all this information. Children we got to get our kids vaxxed, right? We got to push the jab in schools. I mean, if you saw did you see the America First legal thing that I sent you? The leaks?
It was behind a paywall, but I did read some of it before it wanted me to join. I was on my phone all day, so I couldn't check it all. Okay, I saw like the first 4 paragraphs.
Yeah, so I mean, like what they show from the leaks is that, the CDC's talking about like how to vaccinate people when the parents aren't around, how to convince people. It was a lot of equity, a lot of bullshit. But one of the things I want to look at, right, is so see this category right here. This is 0 to 24.
It says stream paused for me. It says you have minimized your application.
Oh my God! All right, hold on. Let me do it like this. Does it work now?
No, it says reduce.
Let me make sure I'm streaming the right window to you. I might have been streaming the wrong window.
There we go. Now I can see it. Yep.
Okay. So this is 0 to 24 years of age, right? This is the entire pandemic. This is since COVID hit. These are the deaths from people under 24. 3,892, right? So less than 4,000.
Yep.
As a point of reference, each year, 2,500 people die from Tylenol overdose.
Yep.
Okay, so you're more likely to know someone that OD'd on Tylenol than you are to know someone 24 years or younger that's died of COVID. Now, here's the really important thing. What this is these are groupings by ICD-10 codes. You said you work in healthcare, you know ICD,
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yes.
Right, so these are groupings by ICD-10 codes. You can go in deeper and look at the actual ICD-10. It's not that important. And what this is these are death certificate ICD-10 codes. So this is everything that is on the death certificate when someone dies. And so what we can see is out of that less than 4,000, almost 1,500. Also, God damn it, why is this like randomly scrolling? Sorry. We can see 1,466 had influenza and pneumonia. Mm-hmm. COVID could cause that, right? Could cause pneumonia. So that's fair. Chronic lower respiratory diseases. This is somebody with COPD, right? Mm-hmm. The flu would have killed them, right? Adult respiratory distress syndrome, COVID could cause that. Respiratory failure, COVID could cause that. Respiratory distress, etc. Now, diabetes. 10% of those people have diabetes.
Yep.
Okay? Hypertension. You're fucking 24 or younger and you have hypertension, right? 3% of people have that.
Yep.
Ischemic heart disease. 1% of people have that. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. 20% of these people are so obese, it's on their death certificate.
Yep.
Okay? And the cherry on top, 10% of people have an ICD-10 code that is grouped as intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning, and other adverse effects. So 10% of these deaths are people in car accidents or people who are poisoned or people who fell off of their ladder cleaning their fucking gutters and like broke both their legs and almost bled out. It is very obvious once you start breaking down the ICD-10 codes that you're talking about probably 2,000 people that died because of COVID and another 2,000 people that died that would have died from something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's looking at this age. I mean, you could go, I've parsed through all this just like you're doing here.
Yeah.
I mean, think about, so let's talk about some of the things that this will show. I still believe this is the case. It's very close. But the average age of death of COVID in the United States is greater than the average life expectancy. So life expectancy in the United States is something like 77 years. The average age of death of COVID, I think, is like 77.8 years or something like that. That means that if you, all things averaged out, people that are dying of COVID on average are doing so at, and you could look at, even without getting into average, you could look very easily where it's like more people over the age of 75 have died of COVID than under. Now, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Think about it this way, right? Let's look at an issue like I was debating recently, the vaccine mandates, Biden's vaccine mandate. That mandate had to do with OSHA punishing employers, which is asinine on face value, that OSHA would, an executive agency. But even take that aside, screw the mechanism of it. We were punishing people, and these were working age people. So that group there that you were looking at, you're basically talking on average, basically people under the age of 60, and far more than that, that proportion is going to be way more people under the age of 50, right? That's what we're talking about. This disease has not been that big of a deal to those people. It's a big deal if you know someone personally that died. Don't get me wrong. Any death is tragic. If your great-grandmother died of COVID, that fucking sucks. I'm not belittling that.
Well, I mean, there are people. Stalin said it best, right? The death of one is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic.
Right. That's exactly right. And so why are we, for a disease that we know what the primary comorbidities are, right? Age is one, right? The second is obesity, right? Then things like diabetes, COPD, and other things. All of these things. Why are we punishing healthy people? Right. And then when you start to mince it even further, it's like, well, the data ever since the Israeli study, which was, when did it? I can't even remember when it came out, but it was early in the vaccine. Like
I think it was early 20, like it was mid 2021 was
like March or something.
Very early in the rollout. Yeah.
Right. And that study looked at millions of people in Israel and was definitive that natural immunity protected you from getting the illness better, protected you from having a serious case of the illness, and lasted longer than the vaccinated immunity. This was clear cut. Yet months after that, these people were still.
To be fair, the data has always shown, right? Has always shown that vaccination status plus natural immunity is better than natural immunity alone, and has always shown that vaccination status without natural immunity was better than just natural. What was better, right? So I mean, like, the vaccine does reduce symptomology, and the vaccine does reduce the likelihood of getting sick. But I want to parse that out a little bit more in a second. But like, just to be fair, right? Like, when you're comparing natural immunity to vaccination status, you're not really comparing like terms.
Well, right, but one, that's not totally true, right? So, like, if you look at the CD, I did a big write-up on this. I could share if you want. This was in January or early February, mid-February in 2022. I did a write-up on this, and I tried to use only sources that were pro-vaccine. Because here's a spoiler alert, what I think about vaccines. I think that the vaccine, like any medication, is a cost-benefit analysis. Like, for example, chemotherapy makes sense for some people. Right, it's risk assessment. And so if you're a 23-year-old NBA player who's probably amongst one of the fittest people in the world, your risk of having a severe case of COVID is so low that the risk of the side effects of the vaccine probably outweigh it. Right, so the government,
a 24-year-old male, right? Like, we have we have plenty of data to suggest that your risk of myocarditis and pericarditis is enhanced. But I think what's even more important, right? And we're not able to have these conversations, and so we're getting into new dangerous territory. And the reason is that we can look at elevated levels of certain chemicals in the bloodstream to determine if heart damage occurs. Right. And so what this is known as is subclinical myocarditis, right? When you have heart damage, but it's not showing up on an EKG. And what we've found is that a majority of people have subclinical myocarditis from the post-vaccine in the first few days. Okay. So there's some level of heart damage. And if you know anything about the heart, you know it's smooth muscle, right? You know that the heart doesn't heal. That's not how the heart works, right? But it's, one dose of subclinical myocarditis from the vaccination, probably the same damage to your heart as like a good weekend on cocaine, right? Like it's not going to fucking kill you.
Right.
The problem is that when we do these studies and we say, well, the vaccine's safe and effective, the vaccine's safe and effective, the vaccine's safe and effective, we don't know what reiterations of boosters means. Like, is it always subclinical myocarditis? Does it reach a certain point where, the sixth booster is the one that does you in, right?
Right.
Or is it just the same risk each time? We don't have that data. We there's a ton of data missing. And the people that are willing to do that data can't get government grants, right? They have to get private grants. They have to use models, right, that are cheaper to use. And then when they use digital models that are cheaper, then the people that get all this big government grants, right, from the CDC and from like universities and shit, where they're getting like this massive amount of income, will be like, oh, well, you're just using a digital model. Like, that's not an appropriate way to do this. Like, this doesn't actually prove anything. It's like, well, the same models you use in your other research 3 years ago, all of a sudden are a fucking problem because I don't have millions of dollars to spend on this.
Well, that's what they do.
Like,
they trust the science. Yeah, they trust the science until the data goes the opposite way, and then they say, "Well, there are problems with these models." But the impetus should always be on the people wanting to coerce other people to prove their point, right? That's the starting point. Now, we're both going to be against that coercion, anyways. But if there is a case to be had, it's like, okay, you have to prove when you're talking about.
Mine is just no. Always no. I don't care how much fucking data you have.
But even
yours
even
is like a certain point, we'll do it. Like,
it would have to be ridiculous, right? But even still, the impetus is on them, right? And the problem is like I did this panel once. There were 4 righties, 4 lefties, and at the end of the panel, I said, I think the difference here is this. I said, how many people here think that you have rights, and for the government to restrict those rights, they need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's necessary to do it? And all the right wingers raised their hands. And I said, how many people think that the government has the right to restrict your rights for whatever reason, and it's up to you to prove that they shouldn't? And all the left wingers raised their hands. In a nutshell, that's what's going on. They believe, look, the starting point is you have to prove that you should. And remember, the entire vaccine mandate and all this stuff, they want amnesty now because what they admitted to you at the time was it was always about making your life a living hell. It was about scapegoating you. It was about doing things. You can't go grocery shopping. You can't go visit your parents in the nursing home. You can't have a wedding for your daughter. It was about punishing you. And the data never backed it up. So the impetus was always on them to prove it. And so when they would cite studies that now the very studies, organizations they were citing like the CDC, when the data goes the opposite way, all of a sudden they're like, well, there are problems with the data. Well, then that's on you. Then you should have never embraced the coercion.
So, I mean, like, so from the very beginning, right? One of the things that people don't understand, right? Because I try and educate, is more than I do try and debate. I just end up debating more because that's how the space works.
Right.
Right. But one of the things that people need to understand is that the way the FDA is set up, and as far as I'm concerned, this is where we probably go our separate ways, right? As far as I'm concerned, the FDA is a genocidal organization and should never exist and should be fully privatized. I should be able to buy whatever fucking medication I want, and private companies ought to rate it, and doctors ought to figure out which ones.
Not that far away.
Prescribing medication, right? The FDA is like, I'm loving that the right is like waking up to how big of a problem the FBI is, and I'm just sitting here like, when are you going to realize that it's all of the 3-letter agencies?
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, they're all fucking corrupt. But I know I'm not saying you specifically, But the thing is that the way the FDA is set up is completely corrupt. The pharmaceutical companies tell the FDA what their definition of a medication and its efficacy is, right? The FDA just approves the label and determines whether or not it's, whether or not it meets certain health guidelines, and it takes their own clinical trials, right? The FDA sometimes will investigate clinical trials or laboratories, right? But they do not have the manpower in any way, shape, or form to investigate all of them or even a quarter of them, right? It's also important to recognize that 25% of all FDA-approved medications in the United States are eventually recalled, right? So they have a 3-in-1 fucking win rate, right? Which is fine until it's your dead grandma, right? Okay, like 75% is a fucking C last I checked, and it's not good enough for me. I demand A's for my kids. right?
Right.
So what ends up happening is with these vaccines is that Pfizer, people will go, oh, well, they changed the definition of a vaccine. No, that's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
Okay. Pfizer simply said, we're going to call it a vaccine. Okay. The other thing that they changed, which was really important, this was data that they wanted to hide from you guys for 75 years, that people fought, right? Some people fought, some people resigned from the FDA, and good on those people, right? To get released, was that they changed the meaning of how they defined efficacy. So remember when they said vaccines are 100%, that was always a lie. But when they said it was 97 or 96% efficacious, they weren't lying. Okay. The problem is that originally the way vaccines defined efficacy was 97% efficacious meant that there was a 97% chance if you got this vaccine, you would not get the disease. And there was a 3% chance that you would, right? And the way they redefined it was after one contact with the disease. So it had a 97% chance of preventing you from getting COVID if you came into contact with COVID once. And what they didn't tell you is that it was 82% for people that were unvaccinated and for people who had never caught COVID.
Right.
Right. And so the problem is that when you reiterate that over and over again, everybody catches COVID. It's just the people that are unvaccinated catch it sooner. Right. And they have more symptomology. And then they change efficacy to talk about symptomology. And so I think it's important to recognize that this was never a vaccine. It was never intended to be a vaccine. It was simply that Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, they wanted to call it a vaccine. So they called it a vaccine. And the initial thing that scared me, which luckily we don't, it doesn't look like we have, though we might have it, right? Because nobody's really doing the research on this. And it may be what is causing excess deaths. I don't know, so I'm not going to make any claims, especially not on Twitch, is antibody-dependent enhancement.
Right.
Is we may be living in antibody-dependent enhancement. I don't know, but it's always a potential risk whenever you have a vaccine that's not sterilizing. So for the audience that doesn't know what ADE is, right? 1,000-foot bird's eye view, because I'm not a doctor and because, this is really complicated shit. But basically, because you're vaccinated to a specific spike protein chain, right? And you get vaccinated, and then the virus mutates. Not necessarily that virus mutates, but like somewhere a virus mutates and it's more infectious and so it beats out in competition the original strain or the strain that it mutated from, right? What ends up happening is that your body doesn't recognize the virus, right? And when you have natural immunity, there's like 7 different structures of the virus that you have antibodies produced for. There's the in layer, right? The in protein, there's the biolipid layer, there's several different structures. You're just getting spike proteins with the vaccine. And so what can end up happening is that if you're vaccinated and a new variant comes out, it recognizes it as not a problem. And so it actually facilitates the virus infecting you into the ACE2 receptors. And so we have no explanation for these massive excess deaths. And so they could be the vaccine, right? It could be other factors that we need to research, like, that we just don't understand, like depression, poverty, inflation, ODs, other things like that. It also could be ADE. It could be that people that are vaccinated are dying from COVID because they're vaccinated.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
there's
hard
other.
to tell.
I've read about this. There's other things, like if you look into the story of Merrick's disease, it was a disease that was occurring through poultry, and with that, they had what was called a leaky vaccine, which was the idea that what happened was Merrick disease. I don't have the exact numbers, but it was something like this. It was such percentage infectious, but when it infected chickens, it had like a 10% fatality rate. The vaccine was almost completely effective at stopping the original strain of Merrick's disease. So none of the chickens that were vaccinated were getting this disease. But now the chickens that weren't vaccinated were dying at like a 90% clip. And ultimately what happened was that vaccine mutated to make the vaccine have to keep up over and over. And the running theory is it mutated because of the vaccine, right? But here's my thing.
This is the danger to a non-sterilizing vaccine, is that every new strain increases the risk of antibody-dependent enhancement. And so if you're taking a vaccine that's not sterilizing, right, like you there's always a future possibility that a new strain will outright decimate, or I should say devastate, because decimate is 10% death rate, right? We'll say devastate, right, which is the 90%, will devastate a population that's vaccinated. while not harming people that have natural immunity.
Right. And so I don't even get into this, right? It is so complicated for the average person that's like working 9 to 5 to like sit down. So like, for me, it's just like this, like, look what they did to your life. Look what they did. They told you that you couldn't have a funeral for your mom while they had a lavish funeral for George Floyd that, by the way, the Nation of Islam did security for. Yeah, right. And for John Lewis, right. Like all these people, they were, how many, I don't even have to go through it with you, the times of these leaders that told you that you couldn't do things, that they were then caught doing it themselves, whether it be getting their hair done, going on vacation, whatever, right? Look at what they did to you, and it was all based on something that we now know was a lie. And not only do we now know it's a lie, we know through the Twitter files that the government was pressuring and coercing social media places to censor people that were pointing out that there was data showing it was a lie. So one thing that I wanted to say that the CDC paper, and I could bring it up if you.
By the way.
Oh, Trump certainly. Look, Trump came out, and I've argued.
2018, he signed into law the creation of CISA.
He backed. Not only that, like let's make it simpler than that. Trump backed Fauci the whole way. Trump came out initially and said when Brian Kemp didn't want to do lockdowns and Sweden wasn't doing lockdowns that they were wrong. Trump came out initially and said the governors that were doing it best were Cuomo and Newsom. So he set the stage. That's what he did. He signed his chance to win the election away by saying 15 days to slow the spread, we have to do this. They ran with it as the tyrants predictably always do. You give an inch, you get their foot in the door, they radically change how we vote, they do these lockdowns, they collapse the economy. It was all predictable for anyone who's remotely paying attention, which I was. And I will say this real quick before I get on to COVID specific. Pay attention to the people that you listen to, the pundits, the politicians, whatever. It's easy to now come out and say this shit, but who was saying it when it wasn't popular? I was saying it. I was offered a job by Trump's campaign, low-level job, like $30,000, to do my county, to be like the head person in my county for Trump's campaign. I turned it down because they said I would have to get rid of my social media. I was like, it's not worth it to me. A week later, I was on here blasting Trump for the shit he was doing. This is in March of 2020. I had people that were following me for years saying, we knew you were a secret Democrat. You sold out. We're constitutional conservatives, and how dare you? I'm like, really? Can you point to me in the Constitution where it says, oh, by the way, none of this shit matters. If a virus comes along, then we could just discard this whole fucking document? But it was amazing to see how many people, my politicians, they wouldn't speak up, my elected representatives. Now everybody is. Oh, it's easy to be Johnny come late. I'll give you a specific example. Ian Miles Chung. He's this big Twitter guy. He's on with Elon Musk all the time and shit. He put a video.
Reporter.
Yeah, he put. Well, or you're talking about Andy. No, Ian Miles Chung's
I thought Ian Miles Chung's did the same thing.
He probably does, but he put a video out that was. I'll take my hat off. I'll try to emulate what he did. When people like me were like, this is going to collapse the economy, he put a 10-second video out that was this. The economy, the economy, the economy, the economy. Making fun of people that were predictably saying, we're going to be suffering economic ramifications for this for years to come. And it's going to, it'll kill people. It'll lower quality of life. It'll lower people's physical, emotional, and mental health. All of it was true. Now he's on there, like that never happened. And I called him out on it on Twitter, and he actually responded. He's like, well, I just meant 15 days. No, fuck you. What you did was mocked people that were right. And so now it's frustrating to me to see how many of these voices didn't say shit when it mattered. When it mattered, when the lockdowns were happening, when the vaccine mandates were being pushed, when people were being basically made their lives living hell, both through legal systems and through culture, because they didn't want to adhere to injecting something into their body that they weren't confident with. Where were these people? They were silent. And now we're supposed to accept that they are these big voices.
To call out my own people, right? I don't have very many friends within the LP, as you can imagine. But to call out my own people, right? The LP in the I can't say the term, but the Prags, we'll just leave it at that, were, had nothing to say about lockdowns.
Yep.
And the only time they had anything to say about lockdowns was when Texas was instituting laws that nullified the federal laws, saying that you weren't allowed to do vaccine mandates. And they were like, this is authoritarian, not allowing businesses to do what they want to do. And it was like, it's to nullify what I mean. Like, yeah, I agree. Like, I think businesses all along should have been able to kick people out if they weren't vaccinated.
Of course. Yep.
Fire people if they're not vaccinated. I think businesses should have been allowed to have mask mandates or plexiglass or every other thing. The funny thing is that, like, the market showed that people were far more reasonable and free market capitalism was far more likely
Yep.
to solve this problem than the government ever was. And the best case study of that was that gym in New Jersey, right?
Yep.
When everyone else wanted to lock down, the gym said, no, you got to be healthy. Obesity is killing people.
Yep.
Diabetes is killing people. Not getting exercise is killing people. So we put in HEPA filters. We put in temperature checks. We put in mask mandates, until you get to your gym machine, right? So that you can breathe healthily. And then people were like, no, we got to shut this down. You got to stay locked in your house and eat fucking DoorDash and get fucking fat on a virus that spreads more readily indoors than it does outdoors because it was created in a fucking lab.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'll show you something here real quick. Let's see if I can bring this up. Hopefully. Now, this is from the CDC's paper in January. And I want you to look at this. It looked at two populations, and that was in New York and in California, and it looked at millions of people. And you can see that what it's doing here is it's separating people in four categories. Those that were vaccinated, and in those, the two categories there are previous infection of COVID and no previous, and then those that were unvaccinated, previous infection or non, right? And if you look at these numbers, I won't go through them all in totality, but I did a big write-up on this and some other papers, my writing here. Vaccinated previous with COVID. If we look at California, vaccinated with previous COVID diagnosis, there was around 1 million people they looked at. There were 3,471 cases. Unvaccinated, around 1.4 million people, and there were about 6,805 cases. Now, these cases are any cases. So that doesn't mean people that were in the ICU. It means any case that was confirmed. It could have been asymptomatic. It's just they found out, because in these places, if you went to the hospital, they tested you for COVID no matter what. So if you broke your arm, you didn't have any symptoms, but you tested positive for COVID, you show up in this test, even though you were asymptomatic, right? What that means is they were proposing a mandate to make your life a living hell for an illness if you previously had COVID. Oh, 1 second here. Let me bring it up. If you had a previous case and were unvaccinated, there were only 6,805 cases over around 1.4 million. That puts your chance of having COVID in this time period, even an asymptomatic case, if you're unvaccinated with natural immunity, at 0.49%. Now, in my estimation, in order to force, I'll end this screen share. I don't think you need it anymore. But in my estimation, wait, how do I do that? Nope. Here we go, the boomer in me. I'll figure it out here. Option. Oh, here we go. End screen share. Stop streaming. In my estimation, the things you would need to prove, now, like you said, you're already against this coercion, which I am 99% of the time. But what you would need to prove is, one, you need to coerce people because the risk to themselves is so bad. The risk is less than 0.5%. Now, second, when you then further look, right, and you look at, okay, well, still, even if you are more protected than the vaccinated, if you have natural immunity, you should still get the vaccine on top of it. And you even said that. You were like,
I do want to point out. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say,
I want to point out that you're going to see more cases in vaccinated in proportion to unvaccinated than actually exists. Because you're going to see underreporting from unvaccinated people, right? Because people that are unvaccinated are less likely to take a PCR test the moment they feel a fucking chill, right? And so you're going to see a higher portion of cases among the vaccinated that aren't being caught by the unvaccinated. So it is something, just to be fair to the data.
But it works the inverse way too. There were probably a significant percentage of people that believed the bullshit. Once you were vaccinated, you couldn't contract the virus. So when they got symptoms of a cold, they never tested because they were like, "Well, this must be a cold."
It's hard to tell, but I feel like people that are vaccinated are more likely to be paranoid and get tested.
It could be, right? No study is going to be without any sort of metric. But even if we accept that, right, this number specifically, that you have less than 0.5% chance over the time frame of this to contract, that's irrelevant to comparing to the vaccinated, right? That's just as an unvaccinated person that had a previous case of COVID, that Joe Biden was saying your life should be made hell. You should have to test once a week. Your chance of contracting COVID over this time frame was less than 0.5%.
This is what I want to point you out. What I wanted to point out, because you were talking to Dylan Burns early on, and I remember I watched it, and I was so mad at you And it wasn't that I was like really mad at you for like being wrong in any capacity. It was just like, I remember I was like, oh my God, there's so much shit he's not talking about, like so much data. And because like I was deep into it, like I had a treasure trove of like 300 studies at the time and was like really like knee deep in the shit. And you were like, you knew what you were talking about, but I was like, oh, you could have nailed him on this. He doesn't know about this one, right? One of the things that you got him to admit was, this idea that is probably a key moment in that debate, and it like really stun locked him, was this idea that like, well, why should people that have recovered from COVID get tested weekly, but people who have not recovered from COVID but are vaccinated shouldn't be tested weekly? Like it makes like you're being a science denier, right? Like you're forcing people that are less likely to get sick and less likely to spread the virus to get tested because they haven't bent the knee to you. And the thing is that like, he was like, well, maybe if you could prove that, blah, blah, blah. It was like, I wanted to scream so loud. I was like, there's this thing called titers. Okay. You can have a blood draw and you can tell whether or not you have antibodies. And it's like, if you have natural immunity antibodies, the fact that titers were never brought up and that you were just going to have to get tested once a week proved that this was all about getting big pharma its money.
That's right.
That's it.
And then here's the other thing, right? People that get the vaccine, sometimes the antibodies don't take either, right? So the argument could be made the same with them. Well, why not test them as well? Why not make them do the titers,
right?
The blood draw, right? Like, so it's clearly, that's what it showed. And what that moment showed with Dylan was
that would have been authoritarian, but it would have been following the science.
That's right.
They never followed the science.
It is the sort of big government lefties are always willing to have you make more sacrifices. Not themselves, right? Dylan was all for it. He admitted, and it doesn't even matter. This is what a lot of people don't understand in the context of a conversation or a debate. Sometimes things could be wrong within the debate. And by the way, the idea of more data being brought up and stuff, I try to keep things simple for an audience that like sometimes getting too much into the data, you lose the bigger point. And it's, as you know, it's like pulling teeth half the time when you're talking to get 1 inch of ground, you have to take 20 minutes because Dylan, and I mentioned this last night, I don't know if you saw it. This is a telltale sign, right? When you ask someone like, do you think you should get tested? Do I think that I should have to get tested? That's someone that's not giving you an answer of what they truly believe, but they're stalling for time. They're restating the question because in their head they're thinking, what? Now it's not always true, but in their head they're thinking, well, where's Rob?
One extreme or the other.
Right.
Because like I'll like GSU Gambit is a streamer, right? And sometimes he'll do that, but that's because he's legitimately thinking.
Yeah.
And is open to having his opinion changed. And so like there are some times when that occurs, more often than not, you're right. Sometimes people are doing that because they're legitimately thinking and being like, fuck, I might be wrong.
Right, but what he was doing here, and what's happening most of the time, is they're thinking, where are you going with this?
He's stalling for his chat to give him the answer because he
right.
couldn't come up with one himself.
Or just thinking like, if I say this, what will Rob say? Well, that should be irrelevant. If you ask me, do you think you should get tested? I would say no. And I wouldn't be thinking, I wonder where Fabian's going to try to screw me with this answer. All right, because we're having a conversation. We're being honest with each other. So anyways, what that showed was he was all for, regardless of what, you might be out there right now not being a science believer and thinking natural immunity is not superior. That's fine. That's your right. But all you need to know in the context of that debate was Dylan conceded that, yes, natural immunity was superior. He conceded that. And he still said, because there was some nominal benefit of even those with natural immunity to get the vaccine on top of it, that they should still be forced to have their life be made hell, to get tested every week until they capitulate and take the vaccine. But as soon as I was like, well, wouldn't that make sense? If it's about stopping the spread, aren't you more likely to stop the spread than those that have a previous case of infection? And he acknowledges he is. I'm like, then shouldn't you get tested every week? And it was at that moment when he was asked to make a sacrifice that he was like, never mind. If it comes to me sacrificing, then I'm okay. And this is the old Bernie trope, right? Where he said millionaires, senators are immoral until he was a millionaire senator. And then he said billionaire senators are immoral. It's the constant, like the left-wing authoritarian that's always willing for you. That, Nancy Pelosi was willing for you to make the sacrifice to not go to a hair salon and get your hair done. But she wasn't willing to make that sacrifice. And neither was, what's her name that looks like Beetlejuice there in Chicago? That woman, it was one of the most infuriating comments ever.
Maxine California. Lori Lightfoot.
Lightfoot, right? Like one of the most infuriating press conferences I'd ever seen. They brought up to her, they were like, look, you banned people going to hair salons, right? And she's like, yeah. And they're like, but you went to a hair salon. And she said, I'm the face of the city. Hygiene matters to me. And like that arrogance, there were bigger examples of hypocrisy, but just that arrogance to just right in your face be like, fuck you, I'm better than you, I'll do what I want. Like it was so blatant. It was like, you're almost impressed. You're like, oh my God. But that's the point I'm trying to, that I was making here with these authoritarians. It's not about what's best. We're looking at this objectively and the sacrifices we all need to make. Now, by the way, apply this to everything. Apply this to fucking Ukraine. Apply this to inflation. Like you listen to Stephen Colbert say, I'm willing to pay $15 a gallon for gas. Sure, because that's a drop in the hat to him. But my friends that are working 60 hours a week to pay for their family, they can't afford that shit. And what the government's telling them is like, well, you need to make more sacrifices. Why is it always us sacrificing? It's never those assholes, right?
So two things I want to talk about. The one you just brought up, which is energy and inflation and energy, right? Because one of the biggest ways that you can combat inflation is reduce energy costs, right? So how do you reduce energy costs, right? Well, there's four ways to reduce. There's four things that need to be invested in and built if you want to reduce energy costs in order, right? In order from the worst to best, right? Number one is fracking, right? Because fracking reduces our coal consumption, reduces carbon emissions, helps fight the environment, and reduces energy costs. Number three, hydroelectric. Number two, geothermal. And number one, nuclear.
Nuclear.
Nuclear. Now, honorable mention to things that could be researched that could help us in the future, like better battery technology, algae biofuels, carbon capture, things like that, right? But nevertheless, these are the ways you reduce it. And so what has the Biden administration done? We shut down a pipeline that was going to fail anyways. People give him more shit than he deserves for that because Keystone has been doomed for a long time because of them fighting against it over and over again. But set that aside. Number two, massive taxes on new oil leases. Okay, well, what happened? Well, they got sued. They lost the court case and said, in Louisiana, saying that it was unconstitutional, the amount of taxes that they were putting on it. So then what he just did is a moratorium, right? He just stopped new oil leases, right? And the oil market is mostly driven by investment. It's not driven by like actual
That's the point.
Demand. So when you do crazy shit like that, it increases the cost.
And when you campaign on, we're going to shut them down. Right. That's what people do. It's the same with the board. I'll just say this real quick.
The strategic oil reserves have not been this low since July of 1984.
Yep.
So he got rid of all of our stockpile, like a third of our fucking stockpiled oil, so that just before the midterms, he could get gas cheap and doesn't give a fuck about that. And of course, they've got to build those oil reserves. So you're looking at a horrible inflation come
right.
Q1,
and it's not to get too off track here, but I'll say this real quick. Like when I debated, the argument that I ran almost every debate was something we call business confidence, right? And this is what people don't understand. Most business investment is trying to read tea leaves. Most businesses would be willing to pay more taxes if they knew that the regulations and the taxes they were paying would be consistent for like the next 40 years. They would favor the consistency, even if it meant a short time, because that's what they want. They are very good at making money, and they're spending billions of dollars looking to the future and saying, and then the energy market's no different, right? So what happens is when Biden runs on a promise of, we will shut these people down, right? And then you're right about the pipeline. It's not that pipeline would have provided huge amounts of energy. What it was the first step on day one of showing my promise was real. I'm going to shut down the fossil fuel companies. So then what happens is a bunch of these companies are like, well, we're not going to invest in future projects. We're not going to fight for these. And then, of course, he's tightening the leases and things like that anyways.
Real quick.
But that's what drives me.
Yeah, real quick. There's something in Austrian economic theory, right, which is like kind of the foundation of libertarianism,
right.
Really, is Austrian economics. What you're describing is something known as low versus high time preference, right? Businessmen that are successful tend to be successful because they have what's known as a low time preference. When time preference is I want it now or I'm willing to plan on the future, right? And so one of the biggest things that is ruining our society and economy is the more government you have, the more welfare you have, the more society becomes high time preference.
Right.
They want it now, right? So when you institute Social Security, for example, right? Now you're no longer forced to put money in the bank, save money for your retirement, because you have a retirement plan of the government taking care of you. So you become more high time preference. And so that's what you're explaining. It's like they don't even care about having higher taxes if they knew that those taxes were locked in for 40 years because they have a low time preference. They're thinking 10 years, 20 years, and they can't do that because the tax rate's going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. It's also important to understand the Laughlin curve, right, from economics. What a lot of people don't understand is that sometimes when you reduce taxes, you actually increase tax revenue, right? Trump did this.
Right.
When Trump reduced taxes, tax revenue went up. And the best way to explain this is to understand it's like you have $10, right? And I sell products. And I have a product that's $5 and a product that's $4, right? Which comes to a total of $9, right? Now, let's say taxes are at 20%, right? So you buy the $5 product that you want with your $10 and I charge you $6,
Right.
right? Now you have $4 and you say, I want the $4 product. And I go, well, sorry, it's $5. It's $4.80 because of taxes, right? But if I reduce taxes by half to 10%, you buy the first product and it's 50 cents, right? So you pay $5.50, you have $4.50 left, and the next one's $4.40. So you get both products that you wanted, and the government gets 90 cents in taxes. So only got 10% reduction in taxes, even though it halved the tax rate, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. People don't understand that sort of investment aspect that, why would you, if you're in the energy industry and you sincerely believe Joe Biden, now the truth is Biden's full of shit. He's not going to eliminate fossil fuels if it means, he'll do so eventually. They're serious about that, but it's not going to be an overnight process. But again, these, these businesses
they have no desire. No. Like, don't let him get away with that. Don't be too charitable. You're being too charitable. They have absolutely zero desire to get rid of fossil fuels. If they did, they would deregulate nuclear energy.
Right.
And they would pump a bunch of money into it.
Well, they do.
I wouldn't agree with the pumping the money into it, but that's what they would do. Instead, they give money to solar energy and wind energy, which is the least effective, that costs the most fucking carbon, is terrible energy that causes brownouts and blackouts and is damaging to the environment in multiple ways. Why? Because they're owned by the fucking oil companies that get them elected in the first place. They have no desire to get rid of oil.
Yeah, that's right. But there are a lot of people that were looking at future investment because of the signals that Biden was saying that was going to not invest, and another thing is oil prices are largely speculative, right? So if you're in those future oil markets and you see that less people are investing in the future, that's going to drive the cost of those up now, right? Which is going to further enhance inflation, along with the other factors such as the massive spending, the supply chain problems because you shut down much of the world. All of this was the predictable outcome of lockdowns, of mass spending, of war, right? All that's the predictable outcome. But when the
Biden administration officials are bragging about antagonizing Russia and Ukraine, and you've got billions of corrupt money poured into Ukraine, and you've got level 4 and level 5 research labs doing gain of function research, maybe not, air quotes there, in Ukraine, and your son's heavily invested, and Russia, perceives a threat because, you're tacitly promising that you're not going to bring these countries into NATO, and one by one the dominoes are falling around their border, and then war happens at the worst possible moment in a fucking breadbasket, and gas prices skyrocket. Of course you're going to see additional inflation.
Right. So it's all terrible.
Like that's all the inflation, and I try and act like they have nothing to do with it.
Right. Which, that's what got me. It was like, right, you guys still helped cause this. So even if you're blaming, it's like, oh, it's not that I was drinking that caused the wreck. It was I was shooting heroin in my arm. Great. It's still your fault. Like, right. Like, I don't get the defense here. But, I wanted to go back to these numbers. This is again from that CDC paper. The CDC, this isn't some right wing, right, like anti-vaxxer. This is a CDC. So we had the percentage.
All we've been citing this whole time.
That's right. So when you look at the percentage of your chance, if you were never vaccinated over this period of time and just had not even quote natural immunity, because some of these people perhaps didn't have the antibodies, right? But just looking at everyone with a previous infection, it was a 0.49% chance of contracting COVID, less than 0.5% chance. Now, the people say, but still you should. So that's number one, why you shouldn't have been able to coerce them. The risk of them was so low anyways. Why would you coerce them? Number two is, okay, but would it benefit them on top of it? Well, the same numbers show if you force that population that has less a 0.49% chance of contracting the disease over this period, if you force them to take the vaccine or they choose to take the vaccine, that number slightly dips to 0.35. Is it worth it? Is it worth for that slight 0.1 percentage to force? Of course not. But then it gets even crazier because the truth is we don't really give a shit about contracting COVID. Like one of the things about Omicron, a lot of people were getting COVID that was asymptomatic, right? We were testing all these people and sure, there were false positives, but many of it was like, oh, Omicron's far less lethal than even the official EU CDC said this.
That's the natural like cycle of any virus, right?
That's right.
That unless you have ADE, for the record. But the natural cycle is, what does best when you in a natural population is a virus that is less deadly and more contagious, right? When a new variant pops up that's less deadly and more contagious, it beats out the old variant. And this is what happened with Spanish flu, right? Spanish flu was devastating America. Well, decimating, devastating, whatever you want to use, right? But it was destroying. So, and what ended up happening is a new variant came up that people were more likely to get, and it was less deadly. And then they got antibodies to both because when you get natural immunity, it's not the one change, it's the change. It's the multiple different protein structures of the virus that you gain immunity to. So early on in Omicron, we always knew that was going. Alpha was fucking rough. To the
Delta. Yeah.
So was Delta. But Delta wasn't as bad, but was more contagious.
Right. And so what we saw was early on, the EU CDC came out and they gave, I forget what the fatality rate was of Omicron, but it was actually less than an average influenza season, right? But nonetheless, not to get off in the weeds about that, right? The entire argument is, we're not concerned about asymptomatic cases. We're concerned about people having serious cases of COVID. Like, we're not shutting down the world over the common cold. Why? More people get the common cold than get COVID. Right? But the reason we didn't shut it down was we're concerned about people having serious effects, right? So if 10,000 people with previous COVID infection re-get COVID and it's asymptomatic, who gives a shit, right? Like that's...
I want to point out two things because we both go into rants, but two things I want to talk about, right? And you brought up this one. I think it's really important. There's this cycle. Government causes a problem and then government sells you the solution.
Right.
And one of the things that we've been talking about, right, was the initial argumentation. Before Yale was contracted to figure out the propaganda for the government, and Yale did a clinical trial, so that they could propagandize people. Before all of that, right, 15 days to slow the spread was the argument, right? 15 days, we got to slow the spread because of the stress on the hospital system. But it's really important to recognize, well, why was the hospital system stressed? And it's certificate of need boards. This is the huge thing that we have to get rid of in this country. Do you know what a certificate of need board is?
Vaguely. I know through my work I've dealt with it somewhat, but go ahead.
Let's say I own a private hospital. In about half the states in this country, it's illegal for me to build an addition to the hospital. Unless I go through an extremely expensive and bureaucratic process where I bring in members of the community. I bring in doctors. I have like a year of like letting them know ahead of time. They come in and they can voice their concerns about why it's wrong for me to build a new wing of the hospital. I have to jump through red tape over red tape over red tape in order to expand a hospital, right? Now, hospitals are designed to be at about 80% capacity, because you don't want a bunch of empty beds. But there are a ton of hospitals in this country that operate at 90% because it's difficult for them to be able to expand because the government has made it exceedingly expensive and costly and time sink in order to be able to expand the hospital. So the government comes in and causes this problem that stresses the healthcare industry. And then a virus comes in that like stresses the healthcare industry to capacity, and they go, oh, well, this is why we need to lock you down. And it's like, no, you caused this fucking problem. Like, if we didn't have con boards, like, we would have a lot more hospitals that were able to take overflow and were not at capacity, and it never would have been an issue in any of the hospitals. Yes, some hospitals might have been stressed when it when there was a bit of a bomb in an area, right? But they would have had plenty of overflow to another hospital. And so it was the government that caused this fucking problem to begin with.
And the other thing is that it's just not true anyways. Hospitalization is actually lower than pre-COVID levels and has been almost the entire time. right? There are
Yeah, but that's 'cause
specific.
he killed all the old people, man.
Well, that's part of it, but this is the narrative. Like, we'll get to it, right? Because they'll say, right, think of it this way. The only feasible argument that they could make to force you to take this medication or to make your life hell is because your poor decision is negatively affecting other people. So it's a pandemic of the, right? Because we wouldn't, and I did this in my debate with Dylan Burns. We would look at me and we'd say, Rob, your blood pressure's high. Therefore, you have to take this blood pressure medication. We're going to force you, or you have to be tested once a day for your blood pressure. And if it's over a certain number, you can't go to work. We would say, no, the government, most people would say, I know what you would say anyways, but most people would say the government doesn't have the right to do that. If you want to make bad choices for yourself, so be it, as long as they're not. So it always cruxed on people not taking the vaccine were harming those that were taking the vaccine. And when you prove that that's bullshit, that actually those with natural immunity were more protected and less spreading than those that were vaccinated, right? Once you prove that, right, then they move on to the next talking point, which is, well, they're overwhelming the hospitals. No, they're not. They're not overwhelming the hospitals. That's bullshit too, right? And so, and again, what's the argument for, and you heard people become monsters. They would say, well, if you didn't take the vaccine and you're hospitalized, you should have to give up that bet. I wanted to debate Destiny on this, right? Because it's like, what figure, at what percent do you say no longer will we treat people that are unvaccinated? 80% utilization? Because that's basically the average in the United States for years before this. Right? So now all of a sudden people who know nothing about it are pointing to it going, this specific hospital in Pittsburgh, PA is at 82% utilization. Therefore, we should stop treating people that are unvaccinated. And it's like, yeah, the average year before COVID was 80% utilization. Right? Or 84% utilization, because a lot of people, not only were people dying, but people were not going to the hospital for other reasons because they were so fearful of COVID. So hospitalization, I could show you articles. My local hospital here.
The pharmaceutical companies are putting out called post-pandemic hypochondria.
Right. People aren't getting other vaccines.
Because so many people, well, no, like that they think they're sick all the time because the media basically, indoctrinated them into the most absurd levels of fear, right? That now every time they have a sniffle, like hypochondria is through the roof because of all of the fear mongering that occurred.
I'll tell you a story, and I've asked my brother, and he's okayed for me to share this story. A local hospital here that's the closest one to me, during the height of the pandemic in 2020, were forced to lay off like 50 nurses. And it's a small hospital, so that was a very significant amount, right? And the reason was they were going bankrupt because the hospitals were barren. People that show up for elective things or preventative health and things like that were no longer going because there was this fear that any minute the hospital could be overwhelmed in COVID. When these nurses were being laid off, I shit you not, this hospital up to that point in like August of 2020 had one case of COVID. One. The hospital is barren for months because people are freaked out that hospitals are about to be overwhelmed. So much so that in the height of a pandemic, this hospital and many others in Pennsylvania were literally laying off healthcare professionals because the hospitals were so barren. Now, my brother had... Okay.
To point out, when people say elective surgery, what that people think of it as like cosmetic surgery, right? And what elective actually means is you're not going to die today if you don't get this surgery today.
And I have
a lot of these surgeries are necessary for, and it's the same thing you'll hear in snuck in, right? When people debate socialized medicine versus free market capitalism in healthcare, right? Is they'll say, oh, well, the waiting list in Canada is, averages 66 days for elective surgeries, right? And in America, it's like 30 days, right? So like, these are elective surgeries. Well, it's like, no, what we're talking about is like a kidney transplant is an elective surgery.
That's right. And so the example I could give is this, and I'll use my brother twice for examples. The first example is this. My brother is in his mid-20s. He has chronic seizures, terrible seizures, or he was scheduled for brain surgery that they thought they exhausted all other options, medications to end these seizures. They were so bad that he would routinely have them and shatter his collarbone because he would see so terribly and fall so terribly. So his procedure had to be put off because these hospitals that had no one going to them were like, sorry, we can't do it because we're afraid that we'll be overwhelmed at any moment now. Then he had a terrible seizure. And my mom, thankfully, was driving him to this same hospital, right? And he always had these seizures in spurts. He would have one and then be very confused for 30 minutes, then have another. And so my mom would go with him into the hospital. My mom walks into the hospital with him. The hospital says, you can't be here. Only patients can be here. Again, it is a barren hospital, but we're worried about COVID, so you can't be here. So my brother goes in. Normally
it's
they
like,
would
dog, if 70 people randomly come through the front door with COVID, I'll leave. Like,
right.
Let me go with my son, you know?
Right. So no one's there, right? The parking lot's empty. My mom's waiting in the parking lot. She thinks she's going to spend the night in the car because they're going to keep him overnight. About an hour later, he comes basically staggering out. And my mom's like, what are they doing? They're like, they said I have to go home. Because, again, they were so worried about COVID that they sent this guy who just had this terrible seizure. They were like, okay, go home. So it's 20 minutes from that hospital to my mom's house. He has a horrible seizure on the way home. My mom, he's seizing with the seatbelt on. So my mom pulls off to the side of the road, opens the car door, gets the seatbelt off, and he flings out of the car, shatters his collarbone again. All because this fucking idea that, we're going to be overwhelmed any minute. And it never happened. This hospital was never overwhelmed. But that's the kind of bullshit that you had to put up with. And so the people that are claiming amnesty and shit, fuck you, right? You're the pieces of shit that developed this authoritarian mentality that led to real world harm. That's one story. There are millions of stories of how the lockdowns, the mandates and stuff.
So there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's something that I think a lot of people missed. And well, they didn't miss the story, but they didn't quite get the story right. And I think it does play into this, which is, you know, this kind of idea that there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government solution, right, or a temporary government program, right? And that is recently, not, you know, a couple months back, we saw that the vaccine was added to the ACIP, right? The Advisory Committee Immunity Practices, I think is what it is, ACIP, which is basically the vaccine schedule for kids, right? And so many conservative pundits, and I saw like Tucker Carlson talk about it, they all got the fucking story wrong. And it infuriates me now because they don't understand what actually happened. So many people are like, they're trying to mandate that your kids get the vaccine if they want to go to school. It's like, that is not what happened. And it infuriates me that so many people miss this. What they miss is that if you add a vaccination to the ACIP, right, what this does is this automatically puts it on the VICP.
Right.
Vaccine
So they can't ever
compensation program. Right. And so the vaccine injury compensation program is what grants legal immunity to these companies to basically, they pay a small portion of money, taxes pay a small portion of money, and then individuals that are injured by vaccines, you don't go to court. You can't sue these people. What you do is instead you basically sue the government, and the government has representatives that are there to represent the interests of the pharmaceutical companies. And it's the evidence that's necessary under the VICP is like less than a court of law, right? So you kind of have like two things, you know, beyond reasonable doubt for criminal cases, and for civil suits, it's, you know, a balance of probabilities, right? And so it's a balance of probabilities, but the standards aren't as high. This is why we get bullshit anti-vax shit being like, you know, fucking MMR caused my kid to have autism. It's like, yeah, and the court case proves it. And it's like, that's the VICP. It's easier to win a case on the VICP. Right. Nevertheless, we just saw the appropriations bill come through, and they increased a 13% increase to the VICP, and they added something that was never added before. And it was this line: and any additional funds that are necessary.
Right.
They know that
it's coming.
Your tax dollars are going to be spent to protect the pharmaceutical companies that are immune to prosecution.
Yep.
For what we know is going to be tons of vaccine injuries.
They know it. They know.
We know,
and
that.
it's for
and
a population
immunity, and that's what really happened. And that's the thing, is that this fear has allowed people to be completely subjective in the way that they look at these things and not recognize what's happening. What's happening is it's like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't fucking in it.
Right. And it's, you know, the policies of the left. And again, it's like you said earlier, they create the problem and then say, well, you have to come to us for the solution. Right. And so like you say what you want. As small government people, right? It is undoubtable that the last 2 years, since, the last 8-9 months of Trump and then going into the Biden administration, specifically regarding COVID, has seen one of the largest increases in government authority, both in the revenue they're getting, the money they're printing, the authority that they've had, literally telling people things like, you can't go to church. Right? You can't go to your daughter's wedding. Like, that's how authoritarian they became. That big government program has, beyond a shadow of a doubt, increased wealth disparity in this country from the poor and working class siphoning to the wealthiest people in one of the quickest, most staggering ways we've ever seen. And their solution is
larger than in all of American history.
Right. And their solution is, let's do more of it. That'll fix it. If we just do more, let's force more lockdowns. Let's force more mandates. Let's force more vaccines. Let's force more boosters. Let's force more spending, right? That's their argument. They cause the problem and then go, oh, geez, it's the same shit in Ukraine, right? Like, not to get too in the weeds, right? But I'm debating people 2-3 years ago, like, are you cool with this in Syria? The intentional provoking of Putin, right? Because we're bombing Syria and Assad, and that's one of the, you cool with this? And they're like, oh, he'll never do shit. And then when he does, they're like, oh, see, we need to be over there. It's like, yeah, you help.
We need $100 billion.
That's not to forgive Putin. I'm not saying Putin's a good guy, but I'm just saying this is what they constantly do. Ron Paul called this out in 2008, right? When he was running, he was like, I'm not saying don't blame the terrorists that hijacked and attacked on 9/11, but if you stick your foot in a pit of vipers, don't be surprised when you get bit. We keep meddling in these affairs, and we keep creating more terrorists, and we keep financing them. And then when the blowback happens, the very people that did all of it are like, oh, shucks. Well, you got to listen to us now. I wanted to get this out real quick, right? I was talking about the severity of COVID, right? So those cases that matter. Suffice it to say, I'm not going to be long-winded about this, which is very difficult for me. But when you look at the numbers, those same numbers that we were looking at, around 1 million people that were vaccinated with previous COVID, and those that were unvaccinated with previous, there was 1.4 million. You could check the numbers out for yourself if you want. But if you look at it, out of 1.3 million people that had a previous case of COVID and weren't vaccinated, over this time frame, you know how many people had to be hospitalized with COVID? 378. 378 out of 1.4 million. That is staggeringly low. But here's the kicker. People say, but still, force them to take the vaccine on top of it. You want to hear the kicker? Over the course of this study, those that were unvaccinated with natural immunity had a 0.0276 chance of being hospitalized with COVID. And if those people then decide to get vaccinated, then they had a 0.0282% chance of being hospitalized. Although the difference is so small, it's statistically insignificant. Yeah. You read that right. The chances of being hospitalized with COVID over the course of this study slightly increased when you force those people to get vaccinated. Now, I will grant that anyone who knows how stats work would say, yeah, but it's so small, it's statistically insignificant. Right. These numbers are all so small, it's statistically insignificant. And you're suggesting making these people's lives hell. Right? So the argument that people tried to default to once it was proven, which is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, that natural immunity is superior to vaccinated immunity. And what they always fall back to is, yeah, but make them do both. Both is better. Bullshit. They're at almost no risk, and both is so marginally beneficial to them. And that's before we even get into a discussion of side effects. Right? We aren't even talking about myocarditis. We're not talking about what I used. I don't even use myocarditis, right? What I used was anaphylaxis. So according to the studies I was looking at, they looked at this study that, again, I used pro-vaccine studies. People whose conclusions were, you should get out and take the vaccine. This is what they said. Allergic reaction or anaphylaxis was reported in 26 out of 8,680 participants after one dose and 27 after 2 doses. So to sum it up, according to the latest CDC paper, those with natural immunity had about a 0.0276 chance of being hospitalized with COVID. But in this other paper, if you get the vaccine, you have a 0.3% chance of having an anaphylactic reaction. That means the risk is 10 times worse that you'll have an allergic reaction to the vaccine than you would have ever been hospitalized with COVID. That's fucking monstrous. That we're forcing. Now, is it true that none of these studies are completely comprehensive? Of course. Is there things that we could say?
I mean, like you're dealing with numbers that are so small that I don't want to play the lefty fucking portion here because I've always been against these mandates, but I do try to be scientific as much as I can about it. And I think the real problem is the authoritarianism is a kind of one size fits all glove. right? And so a great person that I think everyone should look at on YouTube is Vinay Prasad. Vinay Prasad has over 10,000 citations as a oncology researcher. He is also and over 8,000 in the last 5 years. On top of that, he is a epidemiology associate professor. Great guy to just look at the actual science of it. And so the real question here is like when you group all of the demographics together and then you have numbers that are so statistically insignificant that it kind of doesn't matter, like you're right. And because the response is to a one size fits all kind of version of authoritarianism. But the question really should be, which it isn't, this should be a risk assessment, right?
Right.
And so if you want to do an appropriate risk assessment, then you got to look at the data aggregated based off of demographics, right? And so the question is, what is the difference between a 12-year-old and or a 22-year-old male versus what is the difference between a 65-year-old woman with diabetes? What is the risk for a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman? We don't fucking know because clinical trials won't be done until 2023 and 2024 for pregnant women, right? So if you're pregnant, if you're a young woman, reasonably healthy, pregnant, or you plan to get pregnant, or you're breastfeeding, the idea that you get this vaccine is fucking retarded, right? If you're a young man and you're healthy and you're getting out there, and the idea that you get this vaccine, the risk assessment, it's fucking retarded, right? But then the other question is, well, let's look at the data aggregated by boosters, right? It may be that if you're a middle-aged man, that it is better for you to get the vaccine in one booster. But that if you've never gotten COVID, which at this point, I'm surprised I just now caught COVID. I don't know how the fuck I didn't catch it in the beginning, but I got it, right?
I got it in December 2020. My wife was 9 months pregnant. My son was due January 6th, and we both tested positive for COVID. For her, it was nothing. For me, I had a fever of I streamed all 7 days. I got 2 community strikes 2 years later for the videos I did that was literally just, this is me with COVID in December 2020. Apparently that was COVID misinformation, explaining what my symptoms were. 2 years later, after I debated some trans people, I got mass reported on YouTube and got 2 community strikes for videos I did 2 years previous talking about me having COVID. But that gets to my point, right? Like, I don't disagree, and that's what I've said. Listen, I'm sure you agree with this. If you're listening to me or Fabian for medical advice, you're fucking up. Don't, right? Particularly me. Look at me. Do I look like a guy who should be giving medical advice? Of course not, right? You should find a healthcare professional that you trust, give your exact risk assessment, and come to a decision that works best for you. I am not against the vaccine. I am against the mandate. I will not pick on you. If you take the vaccine and it ends up being a poor decision, I'm not going to say, haha, you deserved it. I'll say that's horrible. I feel terrible. If you don't take the vaccine and you end up getting sick, I'm not going to make fun of you. It's a difficult decision. People are rightfully scared because there's so much fear mongering being put in. I get it. Make the decision that's best for you. I'm against the government forcing you to do this shit. The mandates, the lockdowns, that's what I'm against. It should be up to you to make these decisions for yourself. You're right about that it should be a matter of risk assessment, but there's 2 problems, right? One, the data isn't being aggregated in a significant way where people or even medical professionals like at the local level, like the doctor that would be giving you your vaccine, where are they going to see this data? And the reason that it's difficult for them to see the data is because the fucking government is actively censoring people that don't toe the party line anyways. So not only if you do, so your incentive to come up...
line. Let's be honest.
You know what I mean. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So your incentive to do a study like this, first off, your ability to do a large-scale study that would aggregate based on these things is going to be difficult anyways. Second, your incentive to do it's going to be low because you'd be ostracized even in your field, as many doctors were. But thirdly, then you risk... Doctors were seriously risking losing their medical license and being censored on their social media platforms for doing this. So all of this means that your ability to actually see this data was very minimized. But when you do look at the data that's available, even that data that's not aggregated shows that they're wrong, shows that in these particular risk assessment I'm just taking one group, people that had a previous COVID infection. There are all sorts of other groups. Like, what is the risk assessment for a 5-year-old with no illnesses? Well, it turns out that when you aggregate the data, as you already did with total deaths, that more people in that age group are dying from falling downstairs or dying from misuse of over-the-counter medication than are dying of COVID. In fact, at least in 2020 and 2021, I believe both those years, someone you should follow is a friend of mine, Phil Kerpen. He's at Phil Kerpen on Twitter. He's amazing. Just a really brilliant mind. And he does a great job of... Kerpen. Kerpen. And I've had him on my show. He's a great guy. He was in the debate community. I knew him from there. It's a genius level intellect, just a brilliant guy. And one of the things he does is just show data. That's it. He'll just show the data, right? And he was constantly showing throughout 2020 and 2021, respiratory illness-wise was one of the safest respiratory illness seasons for people under the age of 12 that we've seen in recorded history. And yet,
most people are quarantined. You know what I mean? Like, they weren't getting the flu.
Nonetheless,
I mean,
but the idea
fair.
that... But even with COVID, the ability to contract COVID, like there were all sorts of kids were more likely to get COVID that were locked down from schools than were going to schools. I mean, the data is amazing. It's backwards to what you would think, but the data's there, right? And so the problem is the impetus was never on people like me and you that were against the government coercion to prove the case. The impetus is on the people that want to prove the case. And you're right. They never aggregated it. They relied on government censorship and cultural censorship and saying things like, what, do you want grandma to die?
One of the biggest things they did that they had zero data on. They had no data to justify in any way, shape, or form mask mandates, basically in general, but also for children in schools. Right? I mean, there was no data that was just fear. And what we saw from the America First was what they were citing at the CDC was polling data.
Yeah,
they were citing polling data.
Yep.
The idea that you cite polling data to make like government top-down mandates just proves that it's political, that it has absolutely nothing to do with this. I would suggest anyone that really wants to look into this stuff to understand how science works, and again, not someone I would necessarily fully support, but Curtis Yarvin talking about the cathedral and talking about how science works. There's a great interview that he did with Tucker Carlson, where he talks about the way the elite and the academics kind of like work in this new niche-driven science-based kind of government field. And the way that like specialization of knowledge has kind of lended itself to this trust the science kind of thing is very, very interesting, right? Because government 100 years ago, you didn't have these highly advanced specific fields. And so because of that, no one knows what the fuck they're talking about, except for the people that really like understand that highly specific field. And so what ends up happening is, there's this push-pull kind of situation where if you support government narratives and you support, the state and what it is that the state wants, well, then you rise because the money's there, the prestige is there, et cetera. And if you don't, you fall to the wayside. And so the people that we're getting all of our advice from are the people that are incentivized to specifically support state authoritarian control. It's not like an evil cabal of like Jews somewhere pulling strings. It's just the way that a system is set up when you give authority and power to the government.
And what I like to do, because it's difficult, and I'm not sitting here and saying that I'm some brilliant mind that understands these. I don't, right? That's one of the things that I try to stay in my lane, is that I'm a layman when it comes to this. I think that maybe I have a reasonable amount of intelligence compared to other laymen, but other than that, there's nothing spectacular about me, right? And so oftentimes I think what's important to do, because these things do seem overly complicated, they are complicated. Find the easiest issue to prove your point. That's why I focused on people with prior infection. That data was evident from the get-go. It was evident, right? So you might say your end result might be like, okay, Rob, you're right about that. So we should mandate all of those without previous infection. But it's like, but you already see that the people that are making these policies aren't serious. This was never about taking a look, and saying, let's be as focused as possible, using the science, aggregating as much as possible to separate specific groups to come up with. It was never about that. It was always about authoritarian control, right? The other issue that is the best issue to look at is exactly what you talked about with children. It's sort of an appeal to authority that I don't like to make, but you have to understand this, right? This appeal to authority, because one of the things we see, it's the impetus is on the people wanting to coerce you. The government's wanting to coerce you to prove their point, right? And oftentimes what they'll do in all sorts of things, right? When it comes to the medical industry or climate change, is say, look at what all of these international countries are doing. Look at what these international bodies, so we can't be the outlier. When you see it go the opposite way, though, it is astounding.
I wish we would have followed it like Japan did. Japan did great.
Well, but to me, every major Western country knew by mid-2021 that it was a horrible mistake to lock down children. Everyone knew. All the data. There wasn't even an outlier study that I could find that said that locking down everyone, even countries that had mandates, even countries that had lockdowns and other ways were like, yeah, locking down children's a mistake. That's a mistake. All of the data shows that not only does it not help, not only is COVID not that serious for them, not only does this not prevent the transmission of COVID for them, but it's harming them in immense ways, in other ways. The CDC, I forget what her name was, but the woman that was running the CDC basically came out and said, okay, we're going to lift school lockdowns. And now we know that Randy Weirgarten, at one of the largest teachers unions, contacted the Biden administration, contacted the CDC, and within 2 days, the CDC, against all available scientific evidence, decided to reinstate lockdowns for children. Something that will have monstrous effects for these children for years to come. And the idea that this was done with, they didn't even pretend, and it's largely like the mask as well, but on this particular issue, all of us can understand. You could explain to your neighbor that's not looking into this, hey man, they locked your kid down from school for a year. You could see the negative effects of that, right? Of course, they could see it. And it's like, now show me the evidence they suggested that said that that was necessary. They can't. There never was evidence. All of the evidence went the other way. And once you understand that and could show someone, an average person, that, then be like, well, do you think that that was different when they were talking about, vax mandates to buy groceries in New York? Do you think it was different when they were talking about the need to lock down the economy, in Pennsylvania? Of course not. It was never about the science. They were just bullshitting you for authoritarianism.
So, Casimir points out something good. With our schools, maybe it was a hidden blessing. I do think it has woken a lot of parents up.
Yes, that's true.
What's going on in schools, right? CASEL, social emotional learning being in 33% of all elementary schools, but not getting into that right now. What I do want to say though is, I want to dig just a little bit. All right, like we're 99% aligned here, but I do want to dig at you a little bit because I think the real problem with the conservative argument here is that it is engaged in a consequential analysis of whether or not the government is justified in doing something. And I think that's the real problem, is that it's like, okay, well, you say it's on the impetus of the state. The Democrat says it's on the impetus of you, right? And what I say as the libertarian is, no, aggression is not justified, right? Like, aggression is never justified. There's no level of evidence that the government could ever give me where the government has the right to quarantine and lock down people, because that never will be morally justified. Because the problem is once you grant them that authority, and once you say, well, they're justified if you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, that the outcomes will be preferable. Well, that can never be done. Technically, it just can't be done, because what metrics are you using? What are your values, right? Like, what is your subjective analysis of what's better and what's worse, right? What's one life worth, right? You know what I mean? Like, how do we predict what the future will be in terms of, the economy or inflation or heroin overdose? And what I would say is that aggression is never justified. And that's just it. And that if the fear was real, right, and if they wanted to give us the information, in the interim, right, and they want to say, here's what we think, right, then the market would appropriately respond to those things. And individuals freely choosing whether or not they want to send their kids to a certain school, whether or not they want to educate them at a private school, whether or not they want to go to a certain restaurant, right? It's the aggression itself is never justified. And the moment you say that, well, there's a chance it's justified if you can prove that it's justified, right, is the moment that you already grant them the authority to make bullshit claims and bullshit science to prove that it's justified, to get enough dumb fucking normies, right, that get all of their news from headlines and from 30 minutes of nightly news, right, to go, oh, well, I guess it's justified. And then there's, the 10% of you, people like you, screaming into the void going, no, it's not. The evidence isn't there, because you gave them that right to begin with.
Two things. One, that level of argumentation won't work for the very normies that you need to wake up, right? So if I'm saying, look, they locked down schools, all the evidence wasn't there, do you see how terrible that is? They'll say, yeah, I can see that. But if you say, I'm not even going to talk about the data or the harm that it causes, I'm just saying the government should never have the right to lock anything down, you're going to lose most people. They're going to be like, well, what? It is more effective to look at on the specific case why this specific action in a pragmatic sense was devastating, was not based on science and was devastating, rather than try to convince them through a philosophical argument. Secondly, I do sort of disagree with you.
Just for the record, but I do both.
Well, I know,
right? You know what I mean? Like,
but they lose, like, you lose the effect of talking about the specific scenario when you say, by the way, they should never be allowed to do this, because most people aren't going to agree with that premise. Now, they might be able to be talked into that premise at a later date after much, but you would understand that sort of the messaging and the propaganda that people have received for decades through their whole life would say that there are times when the government intervention into certain things is allowed. I will give an example of when I think one of those times. Let's say hypothetically that some biological weapon was unleashed upon the city of New York, one precinct, we'll say, in New York, and it affected and was immediately killing within 2 weeks 98% of the people in that precinct. And the government says we have to quarantine these people that were affected because this is such a lethal virus that if the quarantine was broached, it would lead to high infection rates and high amounts of deaths in other places. Mm-hmm. You're saying the government should not be allowed to quarantine those people.
Yeah.
I just disagree. I think that in that...
I also think everyone outside of them, right, should be able to defend their private property.
Yeah, but that's not how it would work, right? You wouldn't even know.
Right.
So if I just waltzed out, that you wouldn't know.
The airline industry, for example, right, should be able to say, you're from New York, you're not getting on a plane. And the train should say, hey, you're from New York, you're not getting on the train. And the people that own private roads, right, should say, now, when you talk about, let's say, publicly owned goods of transportation out of the city, the government does have the right to restrict publicly owned situations there, right? So, for example, assuming the airline is private, the airline can say no, right? The trains can say no. But the private road, right? The public road, well, the government has stolen said public road. And so it is the duty of the state, to the best of its ability, right, to take the stolen property that they have and utilize it in trust to the best of their ability to protect the private property rights of everyone else, right? So the government has a right in the event of a biological weapon of like 98% mortality, right, to restrict travel on those public roads in that instance, because that is what they're doing. What they don't have a right to do is tell the airlines what to do, tell private property owners what to do, tell businesses what to do. And I can't imagine too many businesses would be open to people coming in from an area that was impacted this way. You see what I'm saying?
They wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. And it's basically, it would be very... How would you know that this person was in that area that was infected? If they don't appear infected, how would you know? Like, it's not like you're running a mom and pop hardware store and someone walks in and you're like, were you one of those people that were infected? Most people won't do that. You'll just be like, I assume this is another customer.
Okay. But let's assume, right, that I'm in New Jersey and I own, I don't know, a restaurant, and just across the bridge, a biological weapon has impacted, and I know that people might be coming from that region. Mm-hmm. I might change the way I let people in. I might shut down completely, right? As a community, we might come together as private property owners and say, no outsiders allowed. That's the reality of the situation.
Well, you could if you were there, but what if you're in Texas, right? And the person travels that far. The problem is, like, you could see,
right. You gave an extreme example. It would change things radically even in Texas.
Well, that's the point, though, right? Like, so I would argue that I would say that there is some threshold argument that we would never say that the government never has a right to impact on your sovereignty in any way, shape, or form. I disagree. I don't think that that's a true statement. I similarly would say I don't think that you should have zero freedom and the government always has the say over you. So then for me, if I could find these hypotheticals that would be like, here's a hypothetical where I think that, yes, in this ridiculous scenario, I could see the government having a temporary restriction of your right to travel because it is so obvious that that right to travel would impact people in a negative way so significantly. Now, that should be met with the highest amount of scrutiny and should be constantly retested. It shouldn't be something done in perpetuity. But given that, that's why I say, okay, if the government was able to prove that there needed to be a lockdown because some disease, there is a hypothetical situation where that's possible. COVID wasn't even 1/10 of the way close to that, though. It wasn't even close.
Let's engage in the consequential analysis of this. If I was to legitimately believe that a bioweapon hit New York City, right, and the government was aware, that it kills 98% of people, and let's say it has an incubation period of 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
You show no symptoms for 2 weeks, right? Assuming that they knew that this occurred, right, and that they were there from the onset, right? What I think the government would do if they just lock down the city, assuming for whatever fucking reason they don't lock down the rest of the city, right, or the rest of the country, assuming they're justified in locking down the city, I guarantee you that private property owners and private businesses and that were set up in a competitive market would be more efficacious and better than the state at protecting people anyways. And what would likely happen is that the government would demand that the economy not collapse and that and demand that people not shut down their communities and stay open. And what they would almost certainly do is facilitate the death of the entirety of the United States. Whereas if we had those rights and we didn't have the authoritarian control of the government, communities would set themselves up and say, no outsiders, go fuck off. And the government would be the one saying, no, we have to keep the economy open. I guarantee that the government's control and power in this situation would actually make it worse as opposed to better. If you want to engage in the consequences.
I don't think, like, because the problem is you're looking at it through the lens of like, well, if the government didn't exist, then that would be taken care of better. But in the current situation we have where our government does exist, right, I don't see mass waves of private, owners all across this country shutting down so much that these private people that would be infected with this incubation period that would be free to leave on foot would somehow not spread that infection elsewhere. I just don't believe that. I don't. That doesn't mean the government would be good.
We saw plenty of Starbucks just shutting down, right, without mandates, and and that was for a virus that kills what, like 1%? You're talking about 98%?
Right. But what I'm saying is I'm not saying the government would be good. They fucking suck.
Analysis.
That's
all I
right.
have to do to prove you're wrong, right? All I have to do to prove you're wrong is get you to recognize that there is a possibility that the government would do a worse job than if we were free. And if you can admit that possibility is true, right, then we know that the crystal ball analysis of justifying actions based off of potential outcomes in the future is not an appropriate metric to measure these things by. And instead, we should be focusing on what isn't aggression, because that is something that we can objectively look at.
But again, that analysis of saying, is there a possibility that the government could get it worse, right? That only would be something that would be evaluated if the possibility that the non-government action wouldn't lead to a disaster, which it obviously would, right? If people contract, I mean, just think about it. Even if
Why is it obvious?
Because there's just no way. There is no feasible scenario that if you said there's nothing we could do, you're free to leave, you have this virus, but go ahead, you can go wherever you want, that somehow a unification of private people around this country would be able to keep those individuals isolated to where they would be unable to spread the disease. It's not possible. It's just not. There would eventually be people that would be like, I'll allow you into my store, because they wouldn't even know that you're one of the affected. The entire country wouldn't voluntarily shut down for that 2-week period. Some people would still be out mingling, mixing it up, right? Those people would then be spreading it for the further 2 weeks, and so it would eventually spread. Now, it's a ridiculous scenario, don't get me wrong. But
it's
what
a
I'm
ridiculous
saying
scenario
is,
because the country's done one way or the other. Right?
Well,
you gave
but
a scenario where the government doesn't have the resources to stop this anyways.
But that could be true. But still, we could see that the role of the government as set up today, that would be a role that we would say, yes, this is a role where the government coercion would be justified. Now it is, and because of that, right, then the argument becomes a threshold argument. It's not that this sort of coercion is never justified. It's that it's almost never justified. And the threshold of meeting that justification should be so high that practically it should basically never be entailed. And the problem is, and I think that the problem you're going to have is the majority of people just won't accept what you're advocating for a total elimination of the government. And so instead it is more
state.
Well, the state. Instead, it's more effective to explain to them listen, if you accept that sometimes the state might have the right to infringe on your right to freely move, for example, or your right to go to church, even if you believe that, it is clear in this specific situation that they have gone far beyond that. They did not meet the basic bare minimum to justify even a temporary restriction of that. And if you don't step up now, these restrictions will become ever more onerous, because it's never been about keeping you healthy. It's about authoritarianism. Once you could win that argument now, there's a better chance of getting to where you want, for people to having a more healthy distrust of the state, because they realize that they've been lied to so great. In a weird way, like Casimir said, look, one of the best things we saw from schools was actually because of it. That's absolutely true. I think that this is a watershed moment for libertarians. I think that it's very simple that this case, with one of the most blatant misuses of authoritarian, not only was the evidence used for the authoritarianism lacking, and now it's being proved to be the opposite, not only is the evidence of the censorship of countervailing views being more evident, but the actual damage and the scope of the authoritarianism is something that was so blatant that most people, good luck explaining to someone why the Patriot Act fucked them over. Good luck explaining to your farmer friend, like, well, you know that they're taking they're surveilling all of your communications. But when you say to them, like, hey, remember when your mom was in the nursing home and she died alone? Remember when you couldn't pay your mortgage because you weren't allowed to go to work? They fucking get that. That is right in your face. And once you could start off that jumping point and be like, once you understand that, now look what they're doing with the taxation that you have. Now look what they're doing with the restriction on your ability to, get free or to get types of healthcare that you would want in other ways. That's my feeling on it.
Right.
But
I would say that the consequences that you're stating, right, is simply evidence of why they shouldn't have this power to begin with. Because
perhaps I think that it should be extremely limited. They will always, I think that it is inevitable that the state will always rear its ugly head. I don't see a system where that won't occur, particularly in complex societies like we have. And I think the best we could hope for is to have people like you, and to a lesser extent me, constantly questioning any of the state's authority on these issues, and to do our best that when it eventually steps over the bounds to have justice against those people that did such in those institutions in ways that kind of set it back to balance. But it'll never be solved. It's a problem that will exist in perpetuity throughout human history, that unless something fundamentally changes with humans, that the state will exist.
Criminals will always exist, right? Every politician is a criminal. Every police officer is a criminal. Every person working for the government is a criminal. Criminals will always exist, right? The issue that I see is, do we attempt to try and grant them moral justification? Well, I think that the best thing to do is to not grant them that, right? And so, like, when you give them this 1% and say, well, there's this 1% where in fantasy, in like the extreme cases where you're justified, I think that has led us to where we are today, right? Like, we had, like, the minarchist origins of this nation was an extremely limited state, and the state has grown to this apparatus because we gave them that 1% justification.
But I think it's inevitable. I think that the state will eventually rear its head. And so to say the best you could do is to limit it as much as possible to understand, right? Because what this comes down to, it's the same argument that I have with the communists. Like, in theory, I do disagree with the communists in theory, but in theory, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But it's just, to me, it's a fundamental difference of thinking, is this practically applicable? I don't think it is. I don't think that we could have a system where we're at today would ever conceivably lead to an elimination of the state. I think that it could temporarily come there. I think that we would have negative impacts as a result of that, and then eventually we would see some form of state or something that acts as if the state, that has the same negative consequences that we see currently with the state. And so I think that
I would say two things real quick. I'll say two things. Number one, just because my house is, if my house is on fire, I put the fire out, right? Regardless of whether or not the house will eventually catch on fire at some point in the future, right? So the argument that, like, well, the state will rear its ugly head in some way, therefore we should justify the state, is like, well, no, my house is on fire. I put the fire out, regardless of the fact that when I put the fire out, there's a possibility or even an inevitability, given enough time, that the house will catch on fire again, right? So I don't know that that's necessarily an argument.
But it's like, but what I'm saying is that basically the state is in effect basically a force of human nature. So in effect, what you're doing is outlawing fire. You could try it. You could say, well, I think fire is always immoral. It always burns down people's shit, so we'll just outlaw it. But it won't work.
I'm saying criminals do exist, right? But that doesn't stop us from trying to stop crime, right? The state is a crime.
But I disagree. The state is only a crime if it is possible to get, just like with fire, right? You could say fire is a crime, right? So we'll outlaw it. But if it's a necessary part of life that it will always rear its head, then it's hard to call it a crime. And if the alternative would be a net worse for people, then I don't think you could say the best you could do is limit.
Well,
This would be
rape is a crime, right?
Yes.
Is it not inevitable that people will rape other people?
Yes.
Well, then by your definition, rape is not a crime. There's nothing wrong with rape.
But again, it's just a matter of
rape will always rear its ugly head.
But it's a matter of you calling the state, the existence of the state, a crime. And it would be the same as if I call the existence of, for example, guns. If I say guns are always used for death and I'm against death, even though death's inevitable, I'm against any instrumentation that leads to death. Therefore, all guns should be illegal. Guns are always a crime. And you'd be like, but guns will always, people, neither's the state.
Right. No, the state is inherently criminal because of the actions that are required. It requires slavery.
No, that's your definition that it requires slavery. That's what I'm saying.
No, definitionally, it requires slavery. Taxation is slavery.
I could say the same thing. I could say that death, I consider death and the causing of death amongst any living thing to be a crime. And therefore, guns, what's required to operate them, is always a crime. Therefore, we should outlaw guns.
No, you couldn't.
Why not?
No, that's not the same logic. Because, number one, a gun is a tool. The state is not a tool. The state is an apparatus made up of individuals, people making actions, right?
Right.
The state is describing the actions that they take that are criminal. Like there's no description of action being taken with the gun.
But again, like if it is an inevitable part of existence and that attempts to remove it lead to worse outcomes, then yes, we could say that it's not criminal. Right? Like, I mean, there's all sorts of things. Like, you could say this would be tantamount
here we go. So let's use the rape analogy then, right? Let's say I live in a village, right? And every year we pick a woman, right? A beautiful young woman, right? And we recognize that rape will always rear its head, right? Like dudes will rape. And we can't stop that from happening. We can only punish them after the rape. So what we do, and this is analogous, right, is we take a young, beautiful woman and we put her in a little hut, right? And if you feel like raping someone, you just rape that girl, right? You just rape that one girl. And everybody in town agrees that if you feel the need to rape, you just rape that one girl. And you know what? If we got rid of that system, there might be more people that get raped, right? But it's okay. It's justified because the consequences are actually better because only one girl is getting raped as opposed to like rape being a persistent problem in society.
No, because again, what you're talking about is you have the fundamental argument of what the state is, as you're saying it's not a tool, it's made up of a collective of people that are taking purposeful actions, right? So you're just setting up like a purge-like society and saying, are we justified in a utilitarian system to be like, well, it's okay to purposely harm people in immense ways for some sort of perceived greater good? That's not what we're talking about because there's fundamental difference here. And the fundamental difference is, one, that without the state, things would be worse. That's sort of a consequentialist argument. But second, that the state's inevitable. Right. And so it is operating basically as a tool.
All of the principal elements in my analogy.
Well, no, because
rape is inevitable. Right. And we're reducing rape. The consequences are better and it is an inevitable action. So if you're using that same logic, you have to bite the bullet and just say that you're okay with the town that has the one rape victim because consequentially it's better and it is an inevitable thing.
No, I don't.
Assuming
I don't have to bite that because I don't have to bite it because, as I said, I'm looking at the state as sort of a force of nature. The act doesn't apply because rape is not a force of nature, right? Even though individuals will always commit rape, that is an action like lying or violence or abuse or battery.
Let me pick that apart then. Like, why is it that rape is not a force of nature, right? But the existence of the state is a quote force of nature that you can detangle from human action.
Because the state is not an action, the state is a tool.
No, we're describing a group of people doing certain things. Like no, the state is not a tool. The state is made up of people that are making acts of aggression that are actively aggressing upon other people.
No, but it is a tool. The state itself is a tool. The state could exist without the act of aggression.
Okay, well, the rape dungeon with the one girl is a tool to reduce rape.
No,
the analogy holds.
It doesn't, because rape. We would agree that rape is always wrong, right? In all consequences, there's never a scenario where rape is justified. You would agree with that?
Agree.
No, you would say the same about the state. There is no action the state could ever take. I disagree.
Slavery. You think slavery is justified?
It's not slavery. Not in all instances. Can you imagine a scenario
to
where
be
state
slavery.
exists where it's not slavery? Define state.
Okay, so a state is a system of governance that is maintained through acts of aggression, stolen, usually including stolen property, theft, and is non-voluntary.
Okay, so for example, if the state exists, what we would traditionally call a state, right? But if the United States government would stop taking taxes tomorrow, right, and it would stop having a system of laws and police, then it's no longer a state.
So if the United States government was purely voluntary and did not take involuntary taxes, right, and everyone chose to be a part of the government and signed a contract to agree to whatever laws they wanted, and they didn't extort your taxes, then it would just be a government. Also, they'd have to give up all of the stolen property that they have.
Okay, well, I think that it's just a semantic definition of what we consider state. What you're really talking about is coercion. Taxation, coercion, right? That's what you're saying. You're
It's
saying
inherent to
coercion
the
is
state.
not necessarily. If you define state as that, you could envision a system of government that wouldn't have coercion, correct?
Yeah, it's called a covenant community, and it's libertarian.
Okay, so for example, hypothetically, tomorrow, every single person that pays taxes in this country, yourself included, could say, I totally voluntarily co-sign to all of this, even if the externalities that forced me to agree to it through legal measures disappeared. I'm just agreeing that the system we have right now is good. So if that were to happen, and in effect, everything would be done the exact same way, it's just that people would all co-sign voluntarily to it, you would say that's no longer a state.
If they gave up all of their stolen property.
What to who?
To the original property owner to the best of their ability.
Who's that? Get back to the Native Americans?
People who homesteaded the property.
How do you prove that?
I mean, that's a difficult thing for sure.
Right.
I mean, the Native Americans didn't homestead most of their property, right? So they don't have a claim to most of it. Like monolithic structures or sacred places where they built things on the surface, right? Like that's fine, right? Some of the property that they've stolen via eminent domain, you have to give that back to the original property owner, right? The taxes you'd have to give back to the people that you stole the taxes from until the state was bankrupt because they've stolen so much taxes. And the rest of the property, right, that you can't determine, you have to abandon.
Okay, so the problem is this, right? And the other reason that the rape analogy won't work is because that we could say that there are certain things in this world that you don't need evidence for, right? Like rape's bad. That would be an example. Genocide's bad.
Aggression.
Right? Like I hate, but it's not just aggression. Aggression's sometimes justified.
Aggression's never justified.
You punch my wife, I punch you back.
But that's not aggression. I'm the aggressor. I punched your wife.
It doesn't matter. There are times that it could still, depending on the person's subjective point of view, you could. I just
name
did.
A justifiable act of aggression. No, you didn't.
Sure,
I was
sure
the aggressor. You were defending your wife. I'm the aggressor.
It's still
I'm
aggression.
The one that committed an act of aggression.
It
No, it's not
depends.
aggression.
So okay, so I punch you, and then your sister punches me back.
The aggression is the initiation of force.
I punch you. You punch my wife. I punch you. Your sister punches me back.
Right.
She aggressing?
You created a brawl. The aggressor is you because you punched me.
So she's not aggressing. I'm not aggressing.
They're just defending
you are.
and trying to stop the attack.
Okay.
Like if you break into my home, right? If you break into my home, right? And and try and steal my TV, right? And I shoot you in the middle of the night, right? I'm not committing aggression upon you. You broke into my home and tried to steal shit and scared the shit out of me and woke me up in the middle of the night.
Right.
You're the aggressor.
Well, it depends on how we define aggression, right? And again, the problem's going to be that the way this practically
I gave you the
plays out
definition.
But what I'm telling you is the way that this practically plays out is there's not an objective crystal ball where you can see this thing. So, for example, you could see how?
Aggression, the initiation of force. The person that initiated force is in the wrong.
Define force.
Destruction of the person's property or self without their voluntary consent.
Okay, so for example, I could be a free-range cattle person, right? Like, you see the movie Open Range? So I'm free-raising cattle, and this person believes that is causing destruction of his land. The free-range person thinks that that's not the case, that this is land that should be available to get from one parcel to the next, and so the person that's upset that I'm on the land decides to come and shoot me. That's not aggression.
Define land.
The land that the person through they're sort of
I'm just
metricing up.
I'm just fucking with you because you're trying to get me to define.
Well, no, I'm not. Right? I'm not doing it to be a dick, though.
The person that's free ranging cattle that steps onto someone else's private property, right, and starts doing things to their property without their permission is the aggressor.
Right. So then what we see, so you would say the shooting of that person would be justified. That wouldn't be an act of aggression.
No, because you become the aggressor if you do not use the minimal force necessary, right? So like if an old lady, like to give you an example, like if an old lady with dementia is walking on the sidewalk, right? Mm-hmm. And then she like trips onto my property. Like she just kind of falls onto my property and she's just going, Rob, it's my property. There's no Rob around here, right? And she just goes, Rob, I baked cookies, right? And she's barely on your property. And then I just start blasting. Right, like fucking, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So, anyways, I started blasting. Right, I'm the aggressor because I didn't use minimal force necessary. Right, like what's required of me is that to the best of my ability, I try and resolve the situation with minimal necessary force. Now, if I can make an argument, like now, if she starts reaching into her waistband and starts saying, "I'm a cap these fools," right, and now she's like a 22-year-old dude. Right, I'm totally justified in blasting because the minimal necessary force is that I'm justified in shooting this person because I perceive a threat and I'm responding to that threat. But the old lady with dementia is not someone that I can just unload 17 rounds into.
But the problem's still going to be a problem of subjectivity because now you're getting into this more kind of out there discussion on what is minimal, right, and what is necessary, right? So let me give you an example. I was on a panel. I won't use people's names, but I could, but whatever. I was on a panel once, and they're being dicks to me, right? Like everyone on the panel is just, making little jokes, blah, 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 blah. And I said to one of the people, I said, you going to accuse me of being a sexual harasser like you did that other guy? Is that what you're going to do? And then be gleeful when you get their viewers? Is that what's up? Now, there's an argument to be had that was not the minimal necessary force to combat that style of argument. Was I the aggressor?
Rob over here fucking refusing to name names, but we all know who he's talking about.
I know
we all know. We all know. All right?
But that's a real story. It happened.
Drama. I just don't usually engage in it.
Me neither. But if they're going to throw it in your face, I figure fuck it.
Right. So now you're asking: is words in a debate an act of aggression? Right. So
well, no,
we're going to go to Webster's 1828, right, as a definition for aggression, which I love to use Webster's 1828 because a lot of times language, especially in the last 20 years,
they know what a woman is
magically been changed. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. So aggression is defined in Webster's 1828, right? The first attack or act of hostility, the first act of injury, or first act leading to war or controversy. Right now, you could say you could try and manipulate it and be like, oh, well, we're leading to controversy. This is the first act leading to controversy, right? Yeah, that's not an act of aggression as we would define it, right? But it's simply because there's no harm done to the person, there's no harm done to the property. What you're talking about is reputational damage, right? Reputational damage is not owned at the individual level. So the person, we'll call him John. We'll just call him John, right? John doesn't own his reputation. His reputation is not private property, and his reputation is not part of his body, right? So if you do reputational damage to him, right, you've not actually damaged his persons, and you've not actually damaged his private property in any regard. Reputation is held by other individuals, right, in their view of John. So that's not an act of aggression. That's just you speaking your mind.
I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I think that I could come up with consequences that would say that it would still be an act of aggression to just go up to someone and be like, go fuck yourself, and just start on. I still think that I would consider that an act of aggression. Hey, thanks for the raid, EOD. I would consider that. Nonetheless, the problem is even the definition you read doesn't say anything about minimal necessary force. So you can see even in this context that we're already parsing to. And the point is, we could go back and forth on this all night. I'd be happy.
No, I'm not going to let you. No, I'm not going to let you get away with that. Right? We're talking about Webster's 1828 definition of aggression versus libertarian philosophy. Right? Obviously, libertarian philosophy is not fully encapsulated in the
Sure.
definition of something that existed before libertarianism.
Right. So then the Webster's definition is irrelevant to this conversation because we're talking about you and your philosophical view
Relevant
of the
to
world.
You demanding a definition.
Well, I'm not demanding like to be a semantic asshole. I'm actually asking, right? Like when you say, because you're making the hinging of your worldview is this: all acts of aggression are always immoral. Correct? They're always evil.
Yes.
That's the fundamental. So I think that in that,
well, I wouldn't. So we got to get away from morality, separate from ethics, right?
Okay.
So, right, I wouldn't necessarily use the term evil. I would just say morally unjustifiable.
Okay.
Right? It's not justifiable from an ethics position because it violates natural law.
So I
One
think that
cannot logically argue against it.
So I think that objectively, anyone that hears that philosophy espoused would say, well, what does he mean by aggression? Like that's a fair take, right? Like if we're saying that this action is always unjustified, well, how exactly
do you define force, right? And it's like, all right, come on, you know what I mean?
But again, like it's still confusing to me because what I'm saying is there will be subjective metrics in this because like when you say minimal force, I'm not asking you to define them. What I'm saying is even if we have an agreement on what those are, subjectively in each situation, people will disagree, right? So under our current legal system, right, you might say this, right? And I understand you would say, well, I don't favor the current legal system, but let's say that my neighbor's dog defecates in my yard. Let's take out ridiculous notions of me shooting him or something like that. Let's say I say, hey, pick up this dog poop that's in my yard. And he's like, yeah, I'll get to it tomorrow. And then the dog does it tomorrow. And so I sue that person. I take that step. A lot of people would say, well, there are a lot of things you could have did before that, right? You could have like knocked on their door and said, can we talk about this in person? You could have called if you're a member of a homeowners association, whatever. There are a lot of things that you could have done before you just took the step of you said one thing to them and then you're like, fine, I'm going to become litigious, right? And so a lot of people would say, well, that's sort of you being aggressive to them because you didn't use minimal force. And then I might counter with, I disagree. Other people have had this problem. I came to them politely the first time. They didn't listen. I just skipped all of the garbage in between. And so both of us could have a legitimate view looking at that situation where he would say this was not minimal necessary force, right? And I could say I do believe this was the minimal necessary force, and you could see you would obviously you would understand the paralysis. Well, but and real quick, you would understand. I'll leave you explain why, but you would understand the paralysis of action because if you're constantly forced to say, I need the minimal amount of force and so you have to go through this like ladder of escalation. I agree with you in principle, but it seems that there's a time where it would be okay to skip steps because you're like, listen, you can see that this is, the burden on me as the landowner in this place to deal for 2 years of dealing with the next slight step up to meet the definition of minimal. I think that it would lead to paralysis of action. And so again, in that sense, both people could legitimately feel the aggressor was on the other side. Now, you would say, well, the person whose dog violated your private property, that's the original aggressor. But that person could also say, because I didn't respond with minimal necessary force, that I too am an aggressor.
So, a lot to unpack here. So, first of all,
can I say this real quick? I got 15 minutes and then I swear I got to I'm so sorry.
We're way over time. It's fine.
Yeah.
But like, so when I say minimal necessary force, right? You're talking about to resolve the situation as it currently stands. We're
Correct.
not talking about, later on during the date when the aggression is no longer occurring, right? Mm-hmm. So like what minimal necessary force would be the situation when you catch the dog pooping on your land, right? Mm-hmm. That's very different than like, how do we resolve what is an act of aggression? The act of aggression has already occurred, right? And now the act of aggression is done occurring, right? Like the dog is no longer on your property, right? The poop is on your property, right? So the minimal necessary force as a human being is to, maybe it's to go knock on their door. Maybe it's to give them a phone call, whatever that is. There's nothing, what you're talking about is an appeal to the kind of the problems of our current legal system and then calling that aggression because you're being litigious. It's not aggressive to sue somebody, right? And even in our current system, it's not aggressive to sue somebody in that regard, even with the problems that are inherent, because if it was like the dog pooped on your property one time, you probably wouldn't even get a court date, right? Like you probably you wouldn't get that day in court, and if you did, that would be an insanely hilarious situation, right? So when you're talking about minimal necessary force, the dog is an interesting example, because then you get into the philosophy of like whether or not what is a dog's life, and like whether or not it's a moral actor, and and then you go into a veganism debate, right? I don't want to use the dog example because it leads to a whole nother line of questioning.
It's fair.
But we use just a human example, right? Like the kids
He's shit in my yard
running on your grass, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm an old man and I don't want the kids on my fucking grass, and the kids keep running on my yard, right? So minimal necessary force would be, yell at them, get off the ground. Like you have to use escalation. You do have to go through that ladder. That's human interaction, period, right? I can't grab a gun and start shooting my neighbor's children because they ran onto my yard to get a ball, right?
Right.
It's the same concept. You yell at them, hey, get off my property. They won't get off your property. So they're little children. So you walk and you forcibly remove them. Like you refuse to get off my property, you push them, right? They injure themselves. And that's the fucking parents' fault that they do, right?
But two things, right? One, I don't understand why the act of aggression not occurring currently, like, so let's say we'll take the dog poop example out. Let's just say the kid. So let's say once the kid runs on my yard and then I look at my Ring doorbell and I see 4 hours later that they're in my yard, I don't understand why your principle of minimal necessary force would no longer apply in that situation after the fact 4 hours. I don't see what the difference is, why that wouldn't continue to apply even after the technical act of aggression has ceased to exist and now we're just looking to a solution. To me, it would be the same. I don't understand what the material difference would be, why that doesn't apply.
Let's say the kids ran on your yard, right? Now you have to buy like fertilizer or something to heal the grass, right?
Okay.
Because you value the grass. They've damaged your property, right? So in this case, the act is already done. This is not right. Now, what you are justified in doing to them, right, is you're justified in walking in their grass and damaging it to the same capacity. You're also justified in demanding they're stopped from arguing the non-aggression principle in this regard up until restitution is paid. So they owe you money for the damage that they did to your property, right? Their children.
Wait. Go back to that statement. They're stopped from arguing the non-aggression principle until restitution's paid.
Up until the value of the restitution, yeah.
Well, that doesn't make sense, because then that gets right back to the same problem of the grazing problem, right? Where we could say, okay, you refuse to pay restitution, I shoot you. You would say, no, that's too far. You had to take the minimal.
That goes above restitution.
Right. Okay. So then I'm allowed to do
that.
But again, so you're saying at that point, so the minimal necessary force no longer applies once restitution, once property is damaged and restitution is forthcoming or hasn't come yet.
I never said that. No, I never said minimal
again,
force isn't.
But again, the problem is, because what we're talking about is a problem of subjectivity, that two reasonable people could come to the conclusion that the amount of force that was applied in retaliation to something wasn't the minimal necessary. And the problem is with that word minimal, right? Like,
yeah. Well, criminals exist, right? And see, the problem is that we tend to look at crime based off of an idea of intent, right? We don't look at crime philosophically in an appropriate way. The way that we should look at crime in an appropriate way, intent matters, right, to the criminal, but that's a separate issue to natural law, right, about who is an aggressor and what is an objectively wrong thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is up to the observer to be able to determine and to mediate in these situations, right? So for example, value is subjective. All value is subjective.
Sure.
Right? So it could be true, right, that I value my grass with my life. It literally could be true. You'd probably be insane, right? But it could be true that you value your grass to an extreme degree, right? And so you could burn down someone's house and it would be morally justified, in that regard, right? But you'd be a crazy person, right? And so the thing is that you have to come to voluntary associations between people to determine how you're going to deal with these situations. And this is why we advocate for things like rights enforcement agencies. We advocate for police. We advocate for rules. We advocate for insurance companies. The difference is that we advocate for systems that are voluntary because that is the only justifiable system.
But again, if one of the two parties doesn't consent to the voluntary system, then what do?
You don't move in next door to somebody that doesn't consent voluntarily to any of the systems that the community is attempting to uphold.
Well, what if it's so if, let's say me in my little town here, and I got, shit, I don't know how big my yard is. I think I got like an acre and a half, right? But let's just say reasonably it's like 20 yards on either side to either of my neighbors, right? So I buy this house and I'm like, hey, I'm not giving in any of this voluntary insurance shit or, mediator shit. Fuck all that. I'll do what I want when I want, right? They're just going to move. They're just like, oh, no one to live there. They just move. They're going to voluntarily relinquish their.
It's not practical. Could be what they do, right?
It wouldn't.
It is
happen.
practical. It's just what would occur if that was the case, right? And this was like a common thing within the community because you don't live in a covenant community, right? Where everyone agrees to it. What you would do is you would look at property and you would say, okay, this property has a certain value, right? Let's say this property has $200,000, right? And there's another one that's $250,000. And they're identical houses and identical land. But the difference is that the other property has an HOA where everyone agrees to certain rules and stipulations, and this other property doesn't, right? So you run the risk that someone in property A that's $50,000 cheaper could move in next door to you that has different values that like let's say they blast their stereo really loud or something like that, right? Whereas there's certain rules that you voluntarily agree to when you move into the property that has an HOA, and you may pay a premium for those certain rules that you so wish.
But that's not how things would work in this system because people already own property. Because like you're doing this like you're playing a game of Civilization. It's like, here's 1 million people moving into this empty space. That's not what it'll be. People already live here. If there was no law, what my neighbor wanted in our community would be vastly different than what I wanted and would be vastly different than what the next neighbor wanted. And even if we did, so there's no argument that we would all agree to the same mediation or we would all agree. I might say, I think that we should, let me put it this way. Even if you did agree to the mediation, there are certainly people that won't agree with the mediator. Even if I agreed with it in principle, said this.
You just conceded the entire debate.
How so?
Because you've already recognized that multiple different communities would want to live under different systems of rules voluntarily, and that you just proved that the state is unjustified because it imposes those implications on others.
No, what I proved is that it's not applicable, that it wouldn't work in practice of what you're saying, that like all of a sudden that these three houses that might have different views.
You're giving the communist logic.
No, what I'm giving is like
logic is one of outcomes and what we prefer to force other people to do so because we believe it's necessary. You
saying that an outcome would occur and me proving that it wouldn't happen isn't me giving communist logic. It's showing that it wouldn't work practically. That if this hinges on, well, if 3 neighbors disagreed and there wasn't some sort of law, then 2 of them would just leave if the third one was stubborn and no one would move in except people that agreed. That's not going to happen. It won't happen. I would feel like what will happen will be there'll be conflict because I'll feel like, well, fuck all this. I ain't moving. My family's had this house for generations. And they'll say the same thing. I'm not moving. I've had this house for generations. Now we're at loggerheads, right? And now it's like, well, the mediation's not going to work. Right? It's just not going to work. And so then you get into this problem of subjective, like, well, what is minimal necessary force? And you get into the problem of what is value. Their kid runs on my lawn. I value my lawn at, let's just put an absurd number on it, like $10,000 worth of value that was diminished to me by their kid being on my lawn. So there's no mediation. So I'm like, fuck it, I'll smash his window. I view that as less. Who's the observer?
Mediation is the observer. The observer is by the voluntary association.
Well, I would have to consent to the voluntary association. I don't.
Exactly, which is why you wouldn't move in to a neighborhood that doesn't have these systems.
But I'm not moving. I'm staying. It has nothing to do with moving. I refuse to move.
You're talking about a situation. Let me back on up here, right? So you're talking about what if we had this system currently and we snap our fingers and this occurred, and then you're doing a consequentialist like commie analysis of like what would occur if we went from the system we have right now instantaneously with everyone's private property to the system I'm advocating for. Peep the name. Right. The name is Fabian Liberty because I'm an incrementalist. Right. Voluntary associations already occurring. The Mennonites do this. The Amish do this. Right. Like what I am advocating for is that societies and groups collectively come together to live in covenant communities based upon the rules that they want to live under, right? Based off of like, if they want to pay tithe, they pay tithe. They don't want to fucking pay tithing, they don't, right? What we're describing when we're talking about natural law, right, is what can we objectively show is morally unjustified. And again, you already proved yourself wrong in that by stating that there are all these different people that will want to live under different rules and different laws and different community organizations, etc. And you're trying to also simultaneously, in a contradiction, morally justify the existence of the state that imposes a kind of natural order onto those people against their voluntary wishes, thus enslaving them.
What I'm telling you is that your system is impossible because some form of aggression will be inevitable in all of these cases, right? Because, like, let's even break it down to the most simple.
What?
Now, listen, let's break it down to the most simple. Like, I don't buy this incremental argument because what I'm saying is even if we would take incremental steps, it would never work. Let's say me and you are neighbors. We both agree in principle to live in the same sort of society we want. We don't have to get into it, but we just really agree. We're friends.
In a covenant community, right?
Sure. We move in next to each other. We agree. Part of the agreement we have is if there's any dispute, we have voluntarily acquiesced to a mediator type system or an insurance type system. And we voluntarily say, we voluntarily say we will abide by whatever they say. Then we have some sort of dispute about, you had your dickhead friends over playing your goddamn rock and roll until 9 p.m. and I had to get up for work at 4 a.m. and so I was pissed. So we have this sort of dispute, right? And we go to whatever we've mutually agreed to mediate, and the mediator says, Fabian, you're right. You have every right, under the contract that we've set up, that you have every right to be able to have your friends over until 9 p.m. playing this music. Sorry, Rob, you're wrong. And I say, I refuse to abide by that. Nope. Now
doesn't matter.
Why?
You're the aggressor now.
Okay, so I don't think I am.
Doesn't matter.
Why?
You already voluntarily agreed to this mediation.
It doesn't matter. So are you saying
criminals
that the mediation?
Exist. So you're saying right? Like we forcibly remove you.
It's not a matter of criminality. Criminality is a matter of the law. Criminals are someone breaking the law. There is no law, right?
You're breaking the law.
So what matters then is subjectively what I feel. You subjectively feel I'm breaking the law. I don't. I feel the mediation was corrupt.
Okay, so I'm the one with the loud music, right?
Yeah.
And
of
so
course.
You're saying, I'm not going to abide by that. What are you not abiding by?
I think that we set forth something that said that there is reasonable expectations of privacy and non-noise pollution, particularly in hours after sunset. And you don't think that it met that criteria of being unreasonable, and the mediator agrees. I disagree with the mediator. I think that the mediation wasn't fair. I refuse. I then feel that it is not an act of aggression to go smash your drum kit. It's not an act of aggression.
Right. Now you're the aggressor.
But not to me. You're the aggressor.
We force you to pay, or we beat the shit out of you. We do whatever we need to do.
I think you think that I'm the aggressor. I think you're the aggressor.
No, that's not subjective. You just proved
of course
that
it's
subjective. You signed a contract. You signed a contract saying that you would agree to a mediator in this situation.
I think the mediator
chose to have.
I think the mediator was wrong. The mediator is not enforcing the contract. I agreed to sign up for the mediation because I thought they would fairly interpret what the regulations were. It is clear to me that they're not fairly interpreting it. Maybe you're friends with the mediator.
You're the aggressor.
It doesn't matter. So then let's say, given that then, let's say that we set up this mutual situation and objectively we could see that the mediator was going to rule for me. However, you went behind the scenes and gave that mediator a large sum of cash in order to get them to change their view, right?
Now I'm the aggressor.
Right, but not to the outside world.
I violated our What do you mean not to the outside world? What are you talking about?
Well, for example, you said... No, because you said that the consequence to me would be force me to pay or beat the shit out of me or something. Assumably, there would be some sort of enforcement mechanism, right?
Yeah.
So that enforcement mechanism comes and beats the shit out of me. Are they aggressing?
Not if you're the one that damaged my fucking property.
No. We're saying that the mediator sided with you only because...
situation that...
No, the mediator sided with you because... The mediator sided with you because of corruption, because you gave monies. You had more money, so the mediator sided with you, right? The enforcement mechanism of that...
I violated the contract.
Sure,
I violated the contract. I'm the aggressor.
Right, but no one knows that. Right? So inevitably an enforcement...
So hold on, pause. What you're talking about, right, is you're trying to make a practical argument. Like, does this not happen today? Do innocent
Sure.
people not go to jail under
Yes.
our current system?
Yes.
Right? Do people not commit crimes? Is fraud not
Yes.
a thing? Right?
Yes.
I'm not a communist. I'm not a utopian. I'm not saying this is a perfect society. Right? What like, criminals exist. In this instance, you branded me a criminal based off of like what we occurred because I violated the contract. I'm the criminal, right? It's, like, that's an unfortunate circumstance of life. Criminals exist. So now we're talking about the practicality of how you prove that criminal intent, right? And so now we're getting into the consequential analysis of whether or not my system would be better at ferreting out corruption and fraud than the current system. And the answer is I don't know, because I don't know that system perfectly. It could be better. It could be worse. Right?
This is not a
concept. It's not obviously going to be better at it over time because it's not a monopoly and it hasn't monopolized that force. And so it would be more valuable and better to being able to ferret out those things. Like
it's the opposite. It's the opposite.
Principles.
No, it's the opposite of a consequentialist argument. The consequentialist argument you're going to lose, right? But before we even get into that, you say that's where your rape analogy comes in. You're like, well, that's consequentialism. That justifies evil shit because you'd say society as a whole would have less evil if we committed this intentional evil act. So we're not operating on the consequentialist framework. What we're operating is your framework that says that aggression is always unjustified. And so any system that predictably will lead to aggression, it would be unjustified to advocate for that system. And what I'm saying is
no. That's the consequentialism. You're absolutely wrong. What you're doing is you're trying to make an argument that the system that I advocate for, as set up and described by you, right? You're getting completely out of the realm of what is justified and unjustified. And now you're saying, I believe, based off of my understanding of your system, that it will lead to additional acts of something, additional acts of criminality, and therefore it is wrong. That is not the same thing about whether or not aggression is justified. You're talking about second and third order consequences of whether or not additional aggression would occur in the framing of how you believe said society would be.
You're true that there is
engaging consequentialism.
There is true that there is a level to consequentialism to that. I'll concede that, right? But it's still inevitable, and you can't argue against it, that aggression will exist predictably because of the system that you're advocating for. Like, because inevitably what will happen is you'll get tired of that, because we already live in this society where people own homes. Inevitably what will happen is you'll get tired of the shit. You'll get tired of it, and you'll say, I'm not moving, and I'm tired of that guy's shit, and so I'm going to do something about it. And it could be, they choose to be nude in front of your kids every day while they're on their property, and your kids on the way to whatever they need to do every day see that nudity, and you're constantly like, stop fucking doing this, and they're like, no, I won't stop doing it. It's my property. I'll do it. Whatever. Okay. There is infinite things that could occur in this, and the problem is that inevitably what will happen is that people will aggress. They will. They will not feel it's aggression because they'll say they are subjectively entitled to it. And this will occur over and over again. The fundamental difference between the system we have today is saying, look, we have set up laws that by nature of living in this country, you have to agree to those laws through coercion. Even if you haven't voluntarily acquiesced, you're forced to acquiesce through coercion. So you can't rape people because the law says you can't. But in your society, you're saying, well, if a bunch of people agree to live in a society and say it's okay to rape people, then that rape's not an act of aggression. It won't occur that way. Even if people similarly have beliefs and have there will always be things on the fringe. And so inevitably what ends up happening is that these sorts of, it's not workable in the consequentialist framework. Things will get much worse because our system's too large and too complex and the cat's already out of the bag. But it's also not going to be
real quick. Yeah. You said you can't argue that there will be less aggression in your society.
Correct.
So actually, I can, and I can prove you completely 100% wrong.
Okay.
It's very simple. You're advocating that your society be based off of aggression. I am advocating a society that is not based off of aggression, where aggression may occur. Aggression is baked into the society. So I absolutely can argue that my society would have less aggression because it is not a feature of the system. It is a consequence of criminals. You are advocating giving the criminals power to aggress and that aggression be baked into the system. And so definitionally, it is absolutely objectively true that you are arguing for more aggression, which is unjustified.
That's not true. Just because, even if that was true, right, that still doesn't prove that there would be less aggression under your system. It doesn't prove that at all.
Absolutely it does.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Not if the consequence
the state is aggressive.
It doesn't matter. If the state being aggressive, right, would lead to 100, some sort of measurement, right, 100 aggression, right, but then not having a state would mean that the system that we're advocating for wouldn't be.
Here we engage in more utilitarian commie talk, right?
Well,
is because what you're saying, it's not more aggression because now you're engaged in the consequences and the utilitarian calculus of said consequences. That is not what aggression is or isn't. Your system is aggressive, period. It cannot not be aggressive. It requires aggression. My system could have aggressors in it, right? And my system could have non-aggressors in it. Yours requires that it be based upon aggression.
Are you an aggressor?
Utilitarian calculus of outcomes.
Are you an aggressor right now in this system?
What do you mean, am I an aggressor right now in this system?
Are you an aggressor in this system that currently exists?
I mean, I have aggressed upon people before in some capacity. Right?
But as you inevitably
aggression at some point, right?
As you inevitably will under any system, you'll be an aggressor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right? So the question is, even under this system, right, where we have the government aggressing, there could be further or lesser levels of individuals aggressing within that system, right? And so to just make the argument through a system of consequentialism that says a system that relies on state, which has some form of limited aggression, such as saying rape is illegal, like that, you would say that's a form of aggression, right? That's coercive to people. If people want to say, I don't think rape should be against the law, you think that they should voluntarily be allowed to live in societies that believe that, correct?
What? No.
Why
Rape
not?
is inherently aggressive.
Not if a
What
bunch
you're
of people...
like, this is a fake straw man. I'm not engaging in this. You understand.
Well,
You
no. No, the reason it's, if we agree, listen, right? If we agree that it's an act of aggression that we're willing to accept. So, for example, if I'm a pirate community, take rape out of it, and I say, our community, we voluntarily agree to live in a community that says might makes right. And if you have enough people to come to my...
There's no reason for me to allow you to continue down this. It's a complete
Why
straw
not?
man.
Why not?
Because you're getting rid of aggression. You're redefining and reshaping the argument.
How am I getting rid of aggression?
Because I'm not a moral subjectivist that thinks that like any society can organize itself off of any moral system, period.
Well,
what I'm saying is that there are things that are ethically can be proven to be unjustifiable, which is aggression. I don't advocate for any society to have the right to deem it okay to rape people.
Well, take rape out of it.
You
right?
advocate for you advocate for aggression, which is a society where theft is baked into the system.
Okay, but why couldn't I voluntarily, under your system, why couldn't I voluntarily have a pirate community that says, we think that might makes right? Trial by force, if you want to take your neighbor's shit, it's okay, and you agree to live there, and I agree to live there because we all think we're badasses, right? That's not aggression at that point.
Yes, it is. Might makes reality. It does not. Might makes reality. It does not make right. Right? Aggression is against natural law.
Again,
period.
It's again
just because a group of people voluntarily choose to aggress upon people doesn't make it right. Right? This is the very argument that I used against you in terms of the rape dungeon or the rape hut with the girl. Right? It's inherently aggressive. It's wrong.
But again, so then we get into the subjective nature of what aggression is, right? So for example, if in that system where I've agreed that my stuff is your stuff, if you could physically take it from me, you say, no, that was still aggression. But if we have a voluntary system that says you're allowed to take 5% of all my worth for community taxes for roads or something, couldn't I still say, well, that's still theft? You'd say no, because you've agreed to it.
It's not, that's not subjective.
Sure it is.
You're adding subjectivity into the system where it does not exist.
What are you talking about?
Gobbledygook.
Right. If I live in a system where I say you're allowed to come in the form of the tax man and take 5% of my wealth at the end of every month, you would say that that's not aggression if that tax man comes, correct?
If you go to a society and you say, look, I'm going to sign this contract that 5% of everything I make will go towards whatever, right?
Roads.
That's no different than hiring an insurance company.
That's still that's
a voluntary transaction,
right?
That's
and so if I similarly set up a system that said instead of 5%, I'm saying that you could come and based on your strength or the amount of people you have or something of that nature, you could take whatever you want. But I'm going to play the same game and take what I want from my neighbors based on that. How is that not similar? Both is taking people's property.
So you're saying you voluntarily go into a system and everyone that is involved is also voluntarily agreed to it.
Yeah, it's like a pirate
So
community
you have
or
100
something.
people, you have 100 people, right? And they all voluntarily agree that, like, the Genghis Khan style, the strongest, one gets to rule over and have whatever they want.
Sure. Yeah.
It's stupid. It's dumb. It's it's inefficacious. It's a bad way to organize yourself, but no, it's not aggression in that instance. No.
Right. And but the problem is this wouldn't be as rare as you would think, right? There would be people that would be undesirable for many communities that would not be able to fit in there for whatever reason. Maybe it is because they're just obnoxious to be around. Maybe it's because they have some sort of illness that most communities don't want to take them in, whatever. And so what happens, and you can see this happening in societies today, one of the last resorts would be to go to communities where they would be accepted. And maybe the communities that would accept them would say, well, here's how we live. We're going to tax that. We're going to do whatever we want, right? We're going to take 30% of your shit. And you'd be like, shit, I have to acquiesce to this because I don't have another choice. Or maybe they say, you're going to trade sexual favors for this. And you would say, well, shit, I have to acquiesce to this. I don't think that we would say just because that person has, quote, right. But you agreed by being there.
Yeah, if you move to a place, right, and you say, like, you can rape me, right? Well, then it's not rape because you agreed to it.
Right.
If you move to a place, it's not theft if you agreed that people could come and take whatever you had collected.
I disagree.
Stupid.
I don't know that I would use the term rape, but I'm saying that people would still feel coerced to make these sort of decisions.
Do you think we should make boxing matches illegal? Do you think boxing should be outlawed? Well, two people voluntarily chose to get into a place and fight, right?
Agreed. So
right.
I don't know.
It's not a question. It's not the initiation of force, right? They both voluntarily agreed to mutual combat.
Well, first off, even in that example, like you could hear colloquially that we would say that boxer was the more aggressive boxer. He engaged in more aggression. So we do say,
yeah, but now you're just trying to slip into subverting definitions to make your argument because you don't want to argue from principles.
No, I'm arguing for principle. I'm saying in the situation that, again, the practical application of trying to apply this would be that there would be all sorts of people that would still be forced to voluntarily agree to something that they wouldn't voluntarily agree to if they weren't coerced in some sort of metric. That's
right, but that's
human
aggression.
Nature.
If you're coercing people into signing a contract against their will, that's aggression.
Right, that's human nature. That's inevitable.
What?
That's inevitable.
Yeah, criminals are inevitable. That doesn't make it right or wrong.
Well, no. Do you think there are any two people that are identical in thought?
I mean, I guess it's possible. I don't know.
Probably not.
What does that have to do with anything?
So let's say we have a community of 100 households, right? What do you think the chances are that those 100 households completely agree on everything?
Almost certainly slim to none.
Right. So if I want to move into this community, there might be 80% of the things that I agree with, but 20% I don't. But I feel because that's my best opportunity to get the things that I want, that I'm willing to accept that, correct?
If that's what you want to do, then you agree to those terms.
Okay, so I agreed to those terms, but we would still say those 20%, maybe that 20% includes paying 5% of taxes for, a fire department and roads, right? I don't like that. I'm still pissed. If I could get rid of it tomorrow, I would, right? But they're still coming and taking that money. Is that aggression?
Wait, hold on. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so let's say,
chat freaking out.
Yeah, no problem. Let's say that part of I do have to leave here. Let's say that
finish your final argument.
Let's say that 5% of taxes is the one thing that I was like, well, shit, I have to accept this to be here. But if it was up to me, I'd snap my fingers and say, don't take this money. I think this is theft. I don't want you taking my shit. I only agreed to it because I was basically between a rock and a hard place, and this was the other shit that I want in a society had. Would that be aggression when the tax man comes to take my taxes?
It's not coercion because the environmental circumstances of your choices lead you into one direction or another. Right,
but how's that different than today's society?
If you voluntarily choose to move to an area, right? It's not an act of aggression if you sign that you want to do certain things.
Okay, so then how's that different from today's society, really? Like it might be true that
one is theft and one is theft and one is you just not liking it.
You don't like it here? Walk away.
I don't give a fuck about your histrionics.
Walk away. You don't like paying taxes?
What do you mean walk away?
Don't live here.
Where am I going to go?
I don't know, but that doesn't
I'm a
prove
hostage here.
Right. Similarly, you're not. You could leave.
I'm a hostage.
Because of this country. This country says you're not allowed to leave?
I'm allowed to leave. Where am I going to go?
Right. But that's not a problem of this state then, right? Because similarly, you would never say that the communities that are set up, right, that they would only be coercive if there was possible places that people could go. You wouldn't say it's the fault of Robistan that I've set up these rules and so many people came here and was like, well, fuck, I have nowhere to go. I have to come here. You wouldn't say that makes me the aggressor. I'd say, hey, you're free to leave. Hit the bricks, right? So that's not me being an aggressor because you don't feel that you have anywhere else to go. So how could you blame any individual state today?
Yeah, I can leave, right? But I can't, and I could presumably renounce my citizenship if there's some place for me to go, right?
But why is that relevant to, like, why is it that this state is only considered aggressive if there's nowhere else to go? Let's say that hypothetically there was a country that opened up, let's say like Algeria opens up and says, no state, it's the exact thing that you're looking for, right? And the United States says, sure, you could renounce your citizenship and go there. Would you then say that everyone living within the United States is no longer living under an aggressive state because all of them could go to Algeria if they wanted?
I mean, assuming America doesn't invade Algeria, which we know they would in that instance.
Well, that's going to be a consequentialist problem with ANCAP in the first place, that the whole world's not going to become ANCAP at once. And so states will invade, the places. But again, that's what I'm talking about. Like, it hinges upon, I don't think that we could say the existence of state hinges, that it's unjustified, hinges on the idea that there must be nowhere else to go that isn't a state. Like, that seems nonsensical.
So, when did you voluntarily sign the Constitution and agree to pay taxes?
Well, I could leave.
When did you voluntarily do that?
I voluntarily did it right now by refusing to leave. So I've accepted it.
If that's your claim, sure, right? It's not my claim.
Well, there is some voluntary. Like, for example, if your parents say you choose.
I was coercing to do it.
And okay, then leave.
No, I'm saying I'm coerced into this situation. I have to pay taxes. Even if I leave right now, I owe taxes I never agreed to the United States.
Right. But again, this is going to be a problem. Like,
is that not aggressive?
But listen, let's say that you and I don't think
never
this
agreed
is
to be here.
Let's say I don't know that this is.
Your argument is you can escape your captor, therefore you were never kidnapped. Therefore, kidnapping is not wrong.
That's not my argument, right? Let's say that you were a person that fundamentally believes, even in a voluntary system, that taxation of any form is unjustified, right? You don't think that you should ever have to give any sort of money to a collective for a collective good. I don't know if you believe that, but you could imagine a person that would believe that, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's say under your system, we now have a system where the state doesn't exist and there's no aggression. We have all these small communities, covenants or whatever you want to call them. And all of the ones that are worth a shit, right? They aren't just like insane, like just free-for-alls. All of them, let's say there are thousands of them, but all of them require some minuscule donation or giving of money in order to reside there for some sort of collective good. So the metrics that you want would all, right? Would you say then that those are coercive because you fundamentally believe that's always, no, you would say, well, that's not coercive because I could leave. I voluntarily have agreed to be here and I could go to the worst societies. But I choose to say that this society that is forcing me to give this money over is one that's beneficial. Once you make that concession and say that then it's no longer aggression, then you're in the poor position of having to argue that if a covenant type society is willing to accept you now, then it is the state itself is not inherently unjustified, because even though you feel that there is no better option for you to leave, there is a literal physical option for you to leave. Therefore, it's not coercion.
No, so here's what you're doing. What you're doing is you're taking out the principal elements of the state, and what you're doing is describing the state from a consequentialist framework and then saying it's justified because you can imagine an area where the consequences are the same, right? Now, that may be true. There may be a situation where, let's say, the whole world is Ancapistan, right? And every single covenant community that exists, right, requires a voluntary contract that requires some form of tithing or some form of, whatever is that. Then you're saying, well, therefore, states are justified because consequentially, I can imagine a scenario where taxes would exist in your world everywhere you go. Therefore, you can't say that taxes are morally unjustified here. What you're doing is you're taking away the kidnapping. You're taking away the coercion.
No, because here's the problem. It is a direct
You're
response.
taking away the voluntarism.
No, it is a direct
You're
response.
You're engaged in pure consequentialist.
No, it is not. This is not
no different than the commie.
No, it is not consequential. You're no different than the commie. You're involved in some utopia that will lead to the degradation of the majority of people's lives.
I'm the one presenting the exact argument that is a potential within my systems. Therefore, it's not what I would prefer, and therefore it is not utopian.
Let me explain why it's not
engaged in the consequential analysis.
Let me explain why this isn't consequential. It's because your argument as to the actual, what is the predictable human nature, it has nothing to, you could say it has to do with consequences, but I think it's more fundamental level than that. We're talking about human nature. Human nature is that you won't find two people that necessarily agree on everything. And so they'll have to, for covenants or communities to exist, of 100 households or more or less or whatever, there will have to be some sort of compromise. That you can't just say everything I want will always be it and I'll find like-minded people in my community. Inevitably, you'll have to have some compromise with your neighbor, with your community or something. And that compromise could be something, we're saying tithing, taxation, whatever you want to call it, something of that nature. And you could say, well, I've looked around and even though I'm against this, I think that it's bad, I'm willing to accept it because I think that this society right here is preferential to all those societies that exist that don't require that. I think those societies have other things about them that I find worse, right? And so you say, well, that wouldn't be aggression then. Even though I don't want to give that money, I have acquiesced by mere fact of living in that community. I've acquiesced to giving that money up because the other things that I see, I consider beneficial. That is a direct apples to apples comparison to if there was a society that people could move to now that didn't require taxation and you could choose to live there, but you said, I don't want to live there because I think it's worse, therefore I choose to remain here, then you couldn't say that the fundamental state of the United States is unjustified because people have an option.
Really long analysis, and you're intentionally getting rid of principal elements, right? So
I don't think so.
Assuming we live in this society, right? There's 100 countries, right? And those 100 countries all have taxation, right? Mm-hmm. And you're saying, and so because of that, like if you want to voluntarily, which is a huge principal difference, right? You voluntarily choose to live in the one that you currently have that has some form of taxation because you believe that it is better than the other places. And there is no free land, right? You can't explore the stars. You can't go homestead property anywhere. All property has been homesteaded, right? It is still, if those systems are within a respecting private property rights and the non-aggression principle, you still very easily could come together with a group of people that have like-minded views that you have, purchase a bunch of property, and then go to any one of these 100 places, offer them enough money, right, to purchase a plot of land under the agreement that you will not pay taxes. And then lo and behold, what you would have is a society that does not have that taxation, right? You're trying to bake into this an assumption that all of the country would willingly and voluntarily have these forms of taxation as a means of defeating it, but you're only doing it from the consequences of the action. You're not doing it from the actual principal elements, which is one is voluntary and the other is not. One is stolen land and the other is not.
You're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not saying that scenario. I'm not saying that you and a bunch of like-minded people agree to pay the United States a huge sum of money for a parcel of land to be left. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that if the argument is that taxation is not theft, if you acquiesce to it. And so even if you're morally against taxation in your vision of society, and you come into a community that requires taxation and you say, morally I'm opposed, or morally is not the best word. You know what I'm saying though. Like, I feel that this is unjustified. All taxation is always unjustified. But this society that requires that taxation, I find preferable to all societies that don't. That I've seen, that I'm capable of physically traversing to and living in. And so I will choose this society, even though I think it is unjustified to require me to pay these monies. And you said that then would not be an act of aggression because I have acquiesced by being there, right?
Let me explain. If I had Elon Musk's bank account, right? Now, and I want to buy a portion of Florida.
Okay.
Right? would it not cause war if I just say I'm going to buy this portion, and I no longer it's going to be its own separate country? Who gets to choose that?
That's a consequentialist
Your elected
argument.
officials, right? No. It's not a consequentialist analysis. What I'm saying is there's no private property owner. There's no private property owner of the United States of America.
Okay. What does that have to do with anything?
So what it means is I can't buy a portion of Florida and then live the way that I want to live.
But that's not
no private property owner.
That's not the example I'm giving. I'm saying that there's somewhere
in the example that you're giving.
No,
in the example where the taxation, don't just say no. I've routed you like 30 times in this discussion.
What are you talking about? It has nothing to do.
Saying.
You're saying you keep switching it to a bunch of people come together in the United States and agree to pay the government but there's no private property. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are places that are uninhabited now, right? But let's not even talk about that. Let's just say that there's a country in Africa through some sort of upheaval that the people there, whoever gets into power says everything is homestead now. Everything, right? There will be no taxation. This will be in Kapistan. You come here if you want. Mm-hmm. And countries like the United States in particular says, we'll give you a plane ticket. We'll send you there. Right. We'll give you a plane ticket. We'll send you. Right. Like you would say then in that situation, because there is a viable way to not acquiesce to this system and instead go to that system, the people that choose to stay, even if they hate the taxes, even if they say, I fucking hate these taxes, but they say, well, I still prefer the United States to that place. Then under your logic, this state of the United States would no longer be a state.
Under one condition, right? Not only do they have to give me the plane ticket, they have to return to me all taxes I've ever paid, including taxes I've ever paid on, sorry, when you buy goods. I can't think of the fucking tax right now.
Sales tax.
Every form, sales tax, property tax, taxes I paid to the IRS, all of those things, right? And they'd have to pay me the subjective value of my home.
Okay, but nonetheless, well, why would they have to pay you for your
property
home?
I've ever owned? And well, if I own my home,
so it doesn't have to be the state that pays you.
Why would that matter? I'm sure I could sell my home. I could sell my home to someone else, right?
Right. But let's say that was accomplished. They say, Fabian, we can't direct. It would be impossible to find. But let's say they say,
even
we know
then
what
it would still be a problem, right? Because now I have to leave.
But let's say that it'll never not be a problem for you because you were born here against your will, whatever. But let's say then someone born tomorrow, once that system exists, the United States is no longer a state, correct?
Well, did they take any taxes off of this person?
The person
never
born?
Bought anything?
The person born? Yeah, but they could have moved to Algeria.
No, they were a child.
Oh, but then again, okay, then your system's not going to solve that because presumably in your system of these covenants, children will be born that haven't acquiesced to the rules of that society. But you would say, well, they're not adults. Like we understand that there are certain limitations.
The problem is that the state has illegitimate property, right? So the state has already stolen property. So it doesn't magically become not a state unless it dissolves all of the property that it's already stolen.
And then nonetheless,
if it did all of those things, then it would no longer be a state. Sure. If it gave the option to give, to let people out of it, right? Allowed people to fly planes, gave up all the money that it previously stole and all of the land that it previously stole. Well, the state would have to dissolve at that point, right? I mean, there's not enough money in the coffers. We're already $32 trillion in debt, right?
But if this place this is the problem with your belief here is that if that society had always existed, and to some extent it has, like you could say that there's no ability to homestead. Sure there is. Who's going to prevent you necessarily from going to certain areas of like bushland areas, right? Once you're in the country, no one would find you.
It's illegal. It's illegal.
Well, but for all practical purposes.
The government found you, they'd punish you.
For all practical purposes, you could theoretically, like there are areas of the ocean that aren't owned by any government. If you wanted to go out there and somehow build a sea land or whatever the shit you used to hear about, theoretically you could do that. The resources might be impractical, but again, that's a matter of consequentialism, right? The problem with your argument is it hinges upon that you're not solving the things that you're claiming to solve. You're just saying, well,
you're not solving the things that solve, right?
I'm not trying to solve anything.
The state has to give up all of the property it's already stolen.
But again, I'm not trying to solve anything. You're saying that any system that advocates for aggression, which you define as people's property, I forget the exact definition, but in general, harming individual physically or their physical property. So taxation would apply, or, coercive laws that said that you couldn't do something you want. Those would all be acts of aggression. That means the advocacy for any state that would do any of those things, like have laws or have taxations, is advocacy for an unjustified system. I'm wrong?
Advocation for a state that would have those things, yes.
But you're being circular then, because your definition of a state is
I'm not being circular. I feel like you're intentionally misunderstanding.
No, I'm not. I assure you I'm not. It seemed to me that you said your definition of a state.
Has the state stolen land? Has the United States of America stolen land from people?
Sure.
Okay.
But again, that's
until it gets rid of that land.
You're circumventing what you're giving an example of what a state is, but when I'm asking for a definition of a state, you can't just say, well, it's this example, because there are states outside of the United States. You would agree with that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we have to have a definition.
I can't give you an example of a state.
Well, you could give examples of a state, but that's not going to be a cohesive definition, right? If I say what's a state, you say
I gave you. Do you want me to redefine state?
No, but you tell me if I'm wrong. I thought that what you defined state as was basically a government that engages in aggression.
A government that engages in aggression, sure, yeah.
Okay, and then when
there are other principal elements, but
right. So then when I asked you to define aggression, you were like, well, only if the state's doing it. Like that's what you just. It's circular. When we were just going in to sort of aggression, and me saying, well, there are other places you can go. You could go to places like Sealand, or maybe places of Antarctica and things like that. I said the problem is you're not able to solve the very things that aggression will still exist. Your problem, you said that it's unjustified to advocate for a system that would have aggression, and I'm saying that aggression would be inevitable in the system, and it's baked in the goods of human nature, because there would still be people by human nature that would be forced.
Human nature, that's animal nature.
No, there would still be acquiescence to sort of things that you didn't agree with, because you thought that you weighed the pros and cons, so you acquiesced to those things, and you say that that's not defined as aggression.
No, you're just saying gobbledygook now.
No, I'm not. I'm not at all.
Sole property. This is aggression. The state has to dissolve to pay restitution for its crimes.
But that's not all aggression. It's not just
a voluntary society, right? Where a group of individuals come together and voluntarily choose to live under certain rules that they all voluntarily agreed to, does not a state make, because there's no aggression.
I disagree. I think that it could definitely, I think that the distinction that you're saying, that you could choose to move with your feet in the system that you're talking about, therefore that doesn't make it aggression if people voluntarily chose to be there. I disagree.
Why do you disagree? Why do you disagree that the principal element between my definition of what a state and state isn't has aggression in it?
Because
why do you disagree with that?
Because to me, it seems that your understanding of aggression, or how you're defining it, would mean that any form of taxation that someone disagreed with, even if they acquiesced to live in that society, would still be considered an act of aggression.
No, I didn't say that.
No, I'm not saying you said that. I'm saying that's what I get from what you're saying. That the individual would say, well, I can't really move with my feet. There's a bunch of barriers, and there's no place that's safe, or no place that would, let's say you're gay. Let's say that you're gay and you live in Georgia, right? And that you need to be around that area of Georgia for some reason, because it's not feasible for you to get elsewhere, right? And you're like, well, shit, the only societies here that I could practically get to are societies that will accept me. The only societies that would accept me are ones that I have to pay some tithe to. Now, I still disagree with the tithe.
Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do this in a different analogy, right? So let's say the government grants company A a whole bunch of special privileges and legal protections, right? And allows company A to commit fraud, right? They're just immune to prosecution from fraud. Right. And then company B isn't immune to a fraud or anything like that. Right.
Okay.
Right? Now, company A grows and takes over most of the domain. Right. Company A is still a problem just because company isn't not a problem just because company B exists. Company A is founded upon fraud and criminality, and company B isn't. Right.
Okay.
The fact that I choose to buy a product from company A because it's $10 cheaper doesn't all of a sudden say well, now company A is morally justified in all of the fraud and illegal things that they've done because you chose to buy something for $30 from company A as opposed to buying it for $40 from company B. The existence of company B doesn't undo the fraud and criminality of company A. The United States is the exact same example.
No one's saying that. The difference would be if you say the mere act of owning a company is something that's always unjustified, right? That's what we're talking. It's not that no one's arguing. No, listen, no one's arguing.
I'm saying company B is perfectly justified.
Right, that's the point, right? No one is arguing. You're
saying because they're both companies, then fraud happens. So company A is fine.
What you're saying is this.
Shop at company
Again, you keep switching sort of the goalpost here. You keep going back to the United States is unjust. Listen, you keep going back to the United States is unjustified. That's not the point you need to prove. You need to prove that advocacy for any state is unjustified, right? And then when I ask you to define state, you're like, well, one that acts on aggression, right? That coerces people through aggression, right? And then when I'm like, okay, let's say that a state exists, right? Or let's say that a governmental entity exists that does everything the United States does, but it's created tomorrow, right? And at the same time that it's created, there's another place created that's like, we're in Kapistan. And that it does the exact same thing as the United States, the exact same laws, the exact same politician, everything the exact same. It's just not the United States. It doesn't own the same land, right? It's a new entity, right? And that state says we're going to do everything the same, right? And it happens to be born out of the southern United States, right? So you that have had a home there historically, whatever, you're still there. You can't just pick up and move. That's not how society works. But you could say, well, theoretically, if you guys don't like this, you could move to Ancapistan. You would say that's no longer a state. That's not a state, right?
No, you're saying that.
No.
You're creating an argument for me that I'm not making. The United States is still a state.
Well, not the United States. We're talking the new state, the southern United State that was created.
Oh, you saying the United States completely dissolves, gives up all of its property?
Well, no. Let's say that just a portion of the South rises again, right? And they, right? And they're like, okay, now we won. We won some military battle, right? And we are going to continue to run with the exact same laws as the traditional United States, right? But we're not them. We didn't steal your money. And you could absolutely choose to leave if you want. You can go ahead. You can leave. Is that a state?
Okay, well, I don't know how they won their land through war or whatever. Like, there's a lot to pick apart there. But let's use a better example. Let's say Elon Musk buys the southern tip of Florida, creates a society, and for whatever reason, the United States is like, hey, you can have this land. We'll sell you this land. And somehow Elon Musk pays enough money to where every person living there voluntarily sells their land, right? Mm-hmm. And then he creates the nation of Muskea, right? Okay. And the nation of Muskea is a voluntary land, and he is the private property owner of that land. And in that land, there is a monopoly on the police. There is a judicial system very similar to what we have. There's taxes, etc. That's not a state. That's a private property owner exercising rights over his private property. And if you choose to want to come to his private property, he has the right to sell you certain land in that private property based upon following certain laws, and you can voluntarily choose to go do so. Muskea is not a state. United States still is.
I disagree.
Why?
Because I would say that there was still, by the definition of what you consider aggression, there would still be people that would stay there. And if you disagree...
So you disagree with me because of my definition that is commiserate with what I'm saying.
No,
you're just
I disagree.
Disagreeing to disagree now. You're just being...
Because there would be people that would feel that they didn't have a realistic option to leave, right? And so because they didn't have a realistic option to leave, maybe you're poor and you have a home in that area that Musk bought and you just don't have the economic mobility to leave. And so you have to stay there. You don't have the option to leave.
Then he didn't voluntarily purchase your property.
Well,
you
again,
sold Musk your property, right?
You choose not to sell.
Did
what if you choose not to sell?
Then he doesn't get to force anybody to sell. That's aggression, which is how the fucking almost every goddamn country in the world was created, was by conquering people and stealing land.
Right,
That's
which is
the fucking problem.
which is inevitable. But even in your system, again, you can see it gets back. So that must scenario that you're talking about is basically the system that you're advocating for, except it would be presumably done at a global scale. And the problem is people are just going to say, no, I'm not moving. No, I won't sell. What are you going to do? Build around them? You're just going to be like, okay, in this little house right here, all of the things that we've agreed on, taxation, blah, 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 all of that, it doesn't apply here to that person, to that one person there. No, and that's what I'm saying. Like the idea, what you're talking about, the reason that fundamentally the aggression would still exist.
No, you've moved the goalpost so many goddamn times, bro.
I'm not.
Like now you're talking about an entirely new scenario, right? Which is about common property and egress when individuals buy property around you and whether or not you have to live under that domain, right? So presumably, right, you still live in the United States of America, right?
Right.
It's just Muskea is all around you, right?
Right.
Now, Muskea would be an aggressor if they did not maintain the egress of your common property that you had before.
Why? It's their
So
property.
Muskea,
They can do what they want.
no, because you had egress before.
Okay, but again, you can see the subjective nature of like what aggression is considered based on all of these little.
You not understanding things or pretending not to understand them doesn't mean you get to add the word subjectivity and then just keep saying things are subjective. They're not.
So now we have to say if you have to definitively prove that at one point you had egress, and if you at one point had egress, then no matter if I buy all the property surrounding you, you're always entitled to that egress no matter what. But what's that egress? Did I get one little path I could walk? Am I allowed to take my car? What if I think that the vehicle that you're taking is outlawed because we have a green society that says you can't use fossil fuels, and you choose to take fossil fuels to go from, right? The problem is, right, in all of these societies, there's still going to be some form of you are willing to accept things that you otherwise wouldn't because you think that those things are preferential as a society as a whole. And given that, right, if we say that that's not considered aggression, then you can't get around the fact that if there is potential for you in the current society that we have now to move somewhere where you don't have to pay these taxes or live in these society, then the current societies that would say, look, these are the rules we set up, you're voluntarily here, would not be unethical by nature.
No. I mean, like, it's just
Disagree.
silly. Right, you're saying that because conflict arises in humans, right, that the state is justified because it is a system that coerces other people into a reduction of overall conflict. That's the communists' argument. You don't believe in bodily autonomy. You don't believe in individual rights. You don't believe in private property rights. You only believe in them. You only believe in them to a certain degree, to the 99%. And you think because consequentially warlords will arise that you can enforce a warlord that's your preference over other people and enforce slavery upon them, so long as that we reduce the amount of slavery to a preferential degree. It's no different than fucking communism, bro.
Again, I guess I'll just wrap up with this. You're advocating for a system that would basically just be local government systems, and you say, but that's okay because if people don't like it, they can move to a different local government to do it if they want. I'm saying that there are people that will not be happy totally with any government system because it's human nature to not agree totally with what any one individual, let alone any one society. So inevitably, people will have to choose things that they wouldn't have wanted, but they'll think that the cost or the benefit outweighs the cost. And you could reasonably say, well, those costs that they're incurring, even though they voluntarily accepted it, that they wouldn't accept if they had any other choice, which they don't, that's not considered aggression. I think that it's nonsensical. Not only is it not practical to have this ANCAP society for reasons you've already talked about, you've contradicted yourself. I don't want to say contradicted. You've pointed out throughout this conversation.
Name one.
One, you said that everything in this world has been through violence and theft. All states.
That's what you want to focus on?
But I think that's a pretty clear indication that if one small area says we're no longer going to abide by this game, that outside people would say we don't give a shit. It's impossible to be utopian and change everyone's mind. You also made the strange admission that if you were a child...
You've yet to do so.
What do you mean? How have I yet to do so?
You're not showing a contradiction by me saying that the world has been full of violence and that states have conquered land.
Well, I said I wouldn't necessarily call it a contradiction. I said I wouldn't necessarily call it a contradiction. It would show the unworkable nature of what you're suggesting, right? Secondly, it is a contradiction that you
because colonialism existed at one point in time, aggression
and
is
still
justified.
would exist. It still would exist.
How do you not see that you're being like communist as fuck right now?
I'm not. You could say that. I'm clearly not being communist. I'm
You're
clearly not
justifying
being.
that people don't have bodily autonomy and that they don't have private property rights, and that those things can be superseded by a state structure as a means of reducing conflict.
Nope,
This is the
that's
same
not what I'm
argument of
doing.
fascism
I'm
and
showing
communism.
it. I'm showing that consequentially, when it comes to utilitarian, you've given the framework for why this won't work. You also did contradict yourself when you said, and I'm sure you'll backtrack now, when you said in the society I was talking about that it would still be aggressive because people would be born there that would be forced to apply to the rules of
That's
that
not
society.
what I said.
That is
You're
what you
picking
said.
apart what I said to change.
That is what
No,
you said.
no,
You said that.
no,
We can go
that is
back to the
not what I
tape and
said.
see.
No,
If
yeah,
you could
that's
retract
not
it
what
if
I
you
said.
want, but that's what you
not
said.
Rob, that's bullshit. Okay, because I've advocated so many fucking times about guardianship, and that the fact that a contract is the emergent will of the adult as a child is one that the guardian takes on that voluntary relationship, and once they come of age, then they have to voluntarily choose to sign the contract in the area or leave the area in some domain.
So then you did say, I can almost verbatim say what you said. I said, if this society like the United States starts up tomorrow and has all the same laws and things like that, and there is an ANCAP society where people could freely go and leave if they don't want to live in this new United States, I said, then at that point, they haven't stolen property or anything. It's voluntarily. And you said, yes, it still would have been aggression because what about the people born there? That's what you said.
No, that's not what I said.
We go back to the tape and look.
No, that's not what I said. That's not no, that's not what I said. That's not my argument.
If you want to, I'm just saying that's what you said. If you want to say that's not what you meant, that's fine. But that is what you said, right?
I mean, I got COVID, so if I misspoke during my frustrations with you, that's not my fucking argument, right?
But again, like there's the problem is in the unique way
because
that
doesn't follow libertarianism or any arguments that I would ever make, right?
So then, what age is it then acceptable to say?
What age is what acceptable to say?
Well, what age would it be acceptable to say that, like, okay, now you're acquiescing to be in this society once you're of a certain age?
Well, I mean, age of consent is a arbitrary measure that society dictates, right? I think appropriate age of consent is probably 24. I think that should be the age of consent with parental permission. At 18 is fine by me. Like I don't necessarily see a problem with 16 or 17 being like the age of maturity with full age of consent being 24. I mean, it depends upon the society. Like, I think it's a difficult thing because it is arbitrary, but you know, if a society said that like 9-year-olds reach the age of consent, then like I think we could pretty much say that there's some abuse occurring in said society, right?
Right.
But it is an arbitrary metric because people mature at different ages. The brain isn't fully developed until 24 to 26.
Okay, but again, we could see how practically your society, where it's like if you don't like it, leave, and there's a bunch of convents and communities, so you could pick the one that's right for you. That 19-year-old that's basically forced because he has no other choice to stay there and continue to abide by the rules of that covenant, and you would say, well, he hasn't reached the age of consent. Other people would reasonably say, of course he has. And so therefore, what you're doing is aggression by forcing this person to pay those monies or to abide by these rules.
Okay,
it just goes to show the subjective.
But that's no different. It's not showing the subjectivity when you only engage in consequentialist analysis, right? Like your moral framework is anti-Christian and anti-capitalist and anti-freedom. It is, because you're just engaging in the consequences of your preferences, right? And then imposing that as a morally justifiable norm that you can enslave others to based upon your personal preferences.
It has nothing to do with enslavement.
It's no different than the communist that says that like the capitalist is exploiting the labor of the individual because they don't have a choice but to work for the wage slaves.
You do the same thing in your society. You just say it's okay because if you don't like it, you can get the fuck out. Literally the same thing.
Yeah. Yes. If it's voluntary, right? Yeah. Love it or leave it. I don't know what to fucking tell you.
Right.
We didn't steal the land. We didn't use aggression.
When I say love it or leave it now, you say, well, there's nowhere to go. Right. And so what I'm telling you is,
I don't say there's nowhere to go. What I say is you stole fucking land and property.
How are you going to set up yours? How are you going? Like, inevitably, someone will have a claim to the land before you, no matter what, once your ideal society begins. They'll say, nope, my ancestors were on that land before you. They were never justly compensated. Therefore, you have stolen land.
Yes, if there is homesteaded property, they're the original property owner. If that land was stolen from them, then you have to pay restitution or give the property back.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Let's say that I'm a poor person now, right? I don't have many means. right? Is there any amount of land in this country that wasn't homesteaded at some point?
Is there any amount of land that the national forest, many of the national forests haven't been homesteaded?
So that's my only option then as a poor person. I have to live in the national forest.
What the fuck are you talking about? How is that your only option?
Because I don't have money to pay restitution for the original homesteaders of all the land.
But you're a poor person. Whose property did you steal? What crime did you commit?
It has nothing to do with stealing property. We now are under your system, right? And under your system, the land all goes back to the original homesteaders, correct?
Okay.
All right. So now as someone who doesn't have connection to that land for whatever reason, right? My family, maybe my ancestors were slaves and never owned land, or maybe my ancestors were immigrants and never owned land or whatever. Maybe they were serfs and, going back and have never owned land going back generationally, right? So now where am I going to live? I have to pay restitution wherever I'm going to land. I have to own a parcel of land.
What the fuck are you talking? You don't owe restitution.
Why?
What are you talking about?
So I could just
Because
move
you
into
didn't
your
commit
property?
any crimes.
So I could just move into your property?
What the fuck are you talking about? You're just playing silly.
Where am I going to live, right? If all the property is owned and I don't have a stake to any of that. Well, excellent question.
They rent. They get a job.
All right. So what if no one's willing to rent to me? Then what?
What then? I don't know. Like that's for you to figure out. You're an individual.
Right.
You have individual
Right. So your
responsibility.
system is only workable if the people, and how many people are we talking about? Like it would be a handful of people that would have the highest stake to the homestead claim.
I don't know. All of the homeless people in LA. What the fuck are you talking about? Like
No, what I'm talking about is you're literally advocating
ask the
a
real
system.
question.
Right. I
instead
am
of trying
asking
to find a trip up a bullshit.
I am asking the real question. What I'm proving is, much like you keep calling me a communist, you're just a left-wing race hustler that wants to go back to the past and say who had the original claim to this land. And you're a give back the land to the Native American type people. Right. Why homesteaders? What about the Native Americans?
I would say the Cherokee in northern Georgia absolutely demand restitution for the
Why
land
just
that was
them?
stolen.
Why just them? What about the Algonquins?
Because they have a legitimate claim of homesteading.
Define legitimate
Private property.
claim.
Okay, so when you look at the Native American, the Cherokee, right, in northern Georgia, right, they built homes, they built houses. They weren't nomadic, right?
Okay.
Right before the Trail of Tears, right?
Okay.
They had a post office. They fought in the Supreme Court for their property rights, right? And then Andrew Jackson just initiated the Trail of Tears and told them to fuck off. They homesteaded that property. They absolutely demand that property. The Cree, on the other hand, like we don't have any evidence of them homesteading property. They were just nomads living off of the land. They didn't.
So it was okay to
homestead
kick. So it was okay to kick them off the land. They're not entitled to everything because they didn't put a home on it.
If they didn't homestead the property, right? So maybe you don't understand homesteading, right? From like
I
a
understand.
lock-in proviso.
I know what you're saying.
Why are
Like
you
the
pretending
squaring
to
up.
not understand it?
Because what I'm saying is that there is always
You're doing sneaky debate bullshit like Dylan Burns is doing to you right now instead of being
I'm
honest.
not doing sneaky
Be in
debate.
bad faith, and you know it.
No, what you're doing is
You understand it, and you're trying to get me to trip up on something that you already understand, so that you can pick things apart. You're being bad faith right now. You know.
No, I'm not. What you're doing is that you keep talking over me and keep expounding on things because you can't get over the clear fact that this isn't rocket science. That inevitably we would be able to point to a very small amount of people if the United States government dissolved and gave the land back to every homesteader, and we say we don't include nomads in that. Fair enough. To every homesteader, that would be a very small portion of people, probably in the thousands, and then your system then would say that is the only justified system to give the land back to those people. And then those people say, now as owners of this land, we will decide what we want to do with the land. And if the vast majority of them say, we want to keep that land and everyone else get the fuck off of here, it doesn't matter if you own a house on one of that parcel of land because it goes back to that homesteader. And they originally had it and the government stole it, which then sold it to you at some point. And so therefore you have to get the fuck out because the person that now owns what was Georgia, the family that homesteaded it originally, or the 7 families that homesteaded it, say, get the fuck out, Fabian. We don't want you here. We don't give a shit. See ya. I don't care that you have a house here. It's ours now.
This is just a deliberate misunderstanding of homesteading and like property and like selling property. It wouldn't be thousands of people. It would be millions of people.
How?
Right? Because people have legitimately purchased property from people in the United States.
But much of that purchasing has been purchased through this. Much of it's been purchased from. There was originally people that homesteaded it, and many of those people had property stolen from the United States. Correct?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, and maybe that meant that either the United States literally took their property, or they were forced to sell because of the theft that was occurring from the United States in the form of taxation and other things, and so therefore they were forced to sell. But shouldn't that property be returned to them?
The property should be returned to the original owner if any property was stolen, right? But plenty of people, more than thousands, right, have legitimately purchased their property. Now, let's assume the property was stolen, and then the state sold that property to a person, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're saying, well, that land wasn't homesteaded, was legitimately homesteaded, and then someone else bought property illegally, right? The purveyor of the crime is the state, right?
Okay.
Right. So
but
both
who gets the land?
Both people. Right. See, that has to be figured out voluntarily between the two people, right? Because because
you can see the problem.
Committed the crime. The state committed the. Yeah, of course it's difficult to get through restitution for the many crimes of the state of which you advocate for. Right?
Let me ask you this.
Problem. It's been hundreds of years of criminality and theft and aggression.
Let me ask you this: there are 350 million.
That doesn't change the morality of the situation.
Let's settle it on this. There are around 350 million people living in the geographic area of the United States.
Yeah, I think it's like 337 right now.
Okay,
yeah.
Right. How many of those people do you think, if your system of giving the land back to the homesteaders, if you just had to guess, what percentage of those people would be landowners?
Who fucking knows, man? I don't fucking know.
What do you mean? This seems to be something that you should have some idea of if it's the system you're advocating. Do you think it'd be more than half,
stupid.
less than half?
What
do you mean?
Stupid. That's stupid.
Why is this stupid? Do you think it'd be more or less than half?
So
That's
now,
fair.
now I have to be a cartographer.
No, I'm asking for some sort. When you're literally saying that we need to give
documentation in my brain of all property that's ever.
It's your system. I'm not saying you're obviously.
It's you.
You're being hyperbolic.
It's you. It's you that demands the consequences and demands the practicality as opposed to the morality from natural law. It's you that goes against that is advocating for theft. And you're saying, well, it seems impractical, therefore it is morally unjustified.
No, what I'm suggesting is that your system will lead to millions of people feeling like their property has been stolen in some manner because someone will say, actually, I have a claim to that land before you did. And so the property that you thought you owned, I could prove that actually my family homesteaded and I'm the legal owner of that property. And so, or even if you've rented property, or you've rented land but put property on it, such as homes and stuff, that now becomes all worthless because what you can't pick up and carry with you and hope that someone that now owns land lets you move on to their land is now worthless, right? And that's so that it will lead to millions of people. Millions of people will be displaced under your system, which you could say is consequentialist. But what I'm saying is even not looking at it through a consequentialist frameworks, that would still be considered aggression by literally forcing people to pick up and move.
No, this is you're misinterpreting intentionally. So let me put it in a modern context under the state that we live under, right?
Can I say I have to be out in 5 minutes, but I'll leave you talk. I do have to be out there.
Yeah. So let's say you buy a vacation home in Maine, right? And you don't go to the vacation home for 10 years. It's yours. You bought it. You spent money on it, right? And you go like maybe once, and then squatters move in, right? And squatters commit fraud and draw up documents to a deed to the house. And then they sell it to a new homeowner, right? And then 8 years, 9 years, 10 years later, you show up to your vacation home to do some repairs because it's your retirement plan, right? I'm going to retire by fixing up this house and selling it. And then you get there and lo and behold, there's a family that has 10 years where they've been living in this home, right? What you're saying is that somehow that's not stolen land, that you don't deserve any compensation, that there isn't a problem here. Of course there's a problem. You own a vacation home and your retirement plan is this vacation home, and squatters moved in and sold it to somebody else. Like something has to be done to correct this situation. My ability to correct this situation and figure out exactly how the government would correct all of this situation does not change the question of whether or not it was ethically justified for the squatter to steal your home and sell it to someone else. That's not the argument.
What I'm
saying
is
it's impractical, so therefore we're okay with it.
unless you have reason to dispute this, I think that any reasonable person would say that less than half of the people that currently reside in the geographical area of this country would end up being landowners in the system that you're suggesting, right? And because of that, we would see mass displacement of people based on the whims of the people that we now say were the original homesteaders that owned that land. So people that had signed contracts and rented property for long amounts of times, who did nothing unethical or untoward themselves, will now be displaced based on the whims of people that now have ancestral claims to land from hundreds upon hundreds of years ago. It is not a workable system in a consequentialist sense, but it also predictably in a non-consequentialist sense will lead to the very aggression you're talking about. It's just that the aggression goes from being what we call the state today to be going to what we now consider are the private property owners of the past.
Yeah, this is you're calling it non-consequentialist, engaging in consequentialism. And of course, the problem with trying to morally justify things through consequentialism is you get to frame the consequences with your little crystal ball about what will or won't happen. And you make justified moral norms about the state being able to do things based off of your preferred outcomes. And that's what leads to socialism.
That's not what I'm doing. What you're doing is you're advocating an unworkable system, which in its own right is something that's immoral. But more importantly, you're not even seeking to solve the principles that you claim to be. Let me ask you this, Fabian. Do you own your home?
Okay. No.
Okay, so you rent, right? Did you sign a contract to rent? Like you reasonably expect to be there for a certain amount of time?
Yeah, signed a lease.
Okay. Okay, so let's say that your system comes into effect tomorrow, right? And now someone says, actually, my name's, so Jim Washington. I have an ancestral homestead claim to, where you're at and 1,000 square miles surrounding that, right? And so get the fuck out of here, Fabian. Do you feel you've been aggressed?
No, yes, I've been aggressed. Absolutely.
Therefore, you're admitting that your system will lead to aggression.
No. The original private property owner didn't aggress upon me. The people that stole the apartment building and fraudulently had me sign a lease are the aggressors. The current property management company is the one that owes me restitution for me to be able to, for however much it costs me to evict the premises and to go find a new place to live and the moving expenses.
Well, I disagree. I think that the idea that the person who kicked you off wouldn't be engaged.
You think the squatters that sold the
you're a squatter. You're a squatter.
Family.
You admit you're
in
a
this
squatter.
Situation.
Do you
in this
know?
situation,
Let me ask you.
Someone else.
Do you think that squatting on someone's land is an act of aggression?
I think squatting on someone else's land is an act of aggression. Yeah, against their will. Yeah.
So you'll admit that you're aggressing right now, constantly.
Who said that?
Well, wouldn't you acknowledge that there's a better than not chance that the original homesteaders of your land aren't the current owners of it?
I don't know that. I'm in Virginia, so probably not.
Well, you talked about how much of this land was stolen, so it's certainly that many people on average would be actual squatters. Because even if you think that
all of this land is technically stolen by the United States government because nobody fully owns their land because of the aggression that is existing in the state, right? But that doesn't mean that technically the land that's stolen is the state. The state is squatting on all of the land with their aggression. But that being said, without getting that technical, right? It's more than likely chance that this land was not homesteaded. I'm in Virginia. Most of the tribes that were here were nomadic.
I thought you said that almost the majority of the country was homesteaded.
Well, I mean,
by definition, it was homesteaded. Someone put a home there.
Yeah, which would be the original private property owner.
Okay, so then it was homesteaded.
Yeah, but we don't know whether I don't know whether or not the land I'm currently on was homesteaded first by a Native American tribe that was been murdered, or whether or not it was a colonist that homesteaded the property and the chain of custody has been legitimate the entire time. I don't know.
But you're pretty certain that the people that originally would be those homesteaders their ancestors aren't the ones that currently own it. Because the government's stolen so much.
I don't know that.
You might not know, but there's a pretty good chance of it.
What? No. What is this weird percentile thing about whether or not I'm living? This is silly. This is a silly line of questioning.
Because your entire argument is that through so much of the theft of the government, that so many people have been disenfranchised and had their property and land stolen because of what the government's done. In fact, the majority of the country, I would say, through hundreds of years of the existence of the United States.
The entirety of the country is stolen by the United States, right? But that doesn't mean that the private property rights haven't had an appropriate chain of custody to where I am now. If someone has evidence that that is not the case, then they need to provide that evidence. And if they can provide that evidence, then yes, restitution needs to be paid.
Okay. I think that people could see, they could judge for themselves. It's clearly an unworkable system, in my opinion. I think that it doesn't solve what you're talking about, that it'll lead to mass displacement of people that have done nothing wrong, that in good faith signed leases or bought property that they were unknowingly buying through something that was stolen through the state or something like that. I think that the problem with the ANCAPs, it's just not workable. It just, you can constantly see how, like, the replacement that would be had would still be people being coerced to do things. It's just that they're told if you don't like it, you could leave. It's an argument that you could make right now. You literally could. So I don't know, but I do have to get going. Yeah. Pisco said he would love to talk to you.
So go ahead, I would say that one of the problems with so many conservatives and the right currently is that they stopped arguing, especially as Christianity has lost some of its influences. Stopped arguing from first principle, and that what you have done is that you have used consequential analysis of what you believe in your head based off of your own subjective analysis would be the pragmatic approach in being able to institute what it is that I advocate for. And therefore you establish moral norms that justify aggression, force, slavery, and the abolishment of bodily autonomy. And that, unfortunately, this is why the power of the state keeps going, because of those instances, and that this is the path to socialism. And until we bite the bullet and recognize that we actually need to argue our ethics and our morality from first principles, and actually recognize that we can't morally justify things based off of the perceived outcomes, that we will continuously have growing state power, and that all of the things that you don't want to come will come to power and will come to pass.
I think the key word there was bite the bullet, because that's exactly what would be happening. But no, I appreciate the conversation. Like I said, Pisco said he'd be willing to talk.
I appreciate a fiery debate.
Yeah, it's no problem. I'm not. Unlike so many people, we could yell at each other, and it's absolutely fine. I don't mind. So Pisco said that I got to go. Pisco said he would like to talk to you about this topic if you would like. But I'm sure you could hook up with him on Discord.
Pisco, DM me sometime.
So
you've DM'd me on Discord before. I think we're good.
Well, thanks for having me on tonight, and I appreciate you coming on my show. But I do have to get going. My wife's going to be pissed because I'm an hour late. But oh well. We'll see you, man. Take it easy. Have a happy New Year.
7 minutes late, actually.
Yeah, not good. So have a happy New Year if I don't see you.
All right, brother. You too.
Take it easy. Yep. All right. I do have to get going. I don't have much time to BS. But no, I just think, yeah. I mean, it's funny, the continuing saying that I'm a socialist or I'm a communist or things like that. I think that you could see, the idea of like, well, we need to trace lineage back to, imagine the fucking Robin DiAngelos and the Tanishi Coates and the Ibram Kendis having a field day over this shit. But the slaves, it was unjust. They were brought here, so they're entitled to land and blah, blah, blah. It's just, what a shit show. It's just not workable. It's one of those things that, it's fun to sit there and argue philosophically, but it's not workable. For me, that is a sign of sort of the immorality of pushing for a system that is entirely unworkable, and is sort of how I feel about it anyways. Anywho, I'm not even going to worry about rating anyone, not to be a dick, but I have to get downstairs. So everyone, thank you so much. New Year's Eve is my wife's birthday, so I'm going to be busy on that day. Plus, we're still doing some leftover Christmas stuff. So I do appreciate each and every one of you. The next time you'll see me streaming, probably Monday, though there is some work stuff coming up, so I don't know. But I do promise after the new year to be able to talk more with you all and to be able to do more streams. I'm going to try to kind of work with my audience and see what kind of streams they're looking for. I was thinking of trying to do one debate review a week, maybe watching one of my old videos or debates a week, then doing a regular show once a week, and then The Drunken Debates thing will be on Friday. Show with John Burke on Saturday. So I'll kick around some of those ideas. But yeah, at the start of the new year, I should be more consistent on this. Thank you so much, everyone. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks to Fabian Liberty. I disagree with the system that he's advocating for. That was supposed to be a discussion on COVID. The other thing is, I think the practical nature is when instead of talking to people about sort of the censorship that occurred surrounding COVID and, the science not being on the side and the people that were willfully encouraging sort of terrible outcomes on people because they wanted to twist their arms to make them make decisions. Instead of having those sorts of conversations, when you say the state doesn't have a right to exist and all taxation is immoral, et cetera,